Chapter 16 of Oh, Money, Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Lee Paquette. Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 16. The Fly in the Ointment. In August, Father Duff died. Miss Flora came home at once. James Blaisdell was already in town. Hattie was at the mountains. She wrote that she could not think of coming down for the funeral, but she ordered an expensive wreath. Frank and Jane were in the far west and could not possibly have arrived in time anyway. None of the young people came. Mr. Smith helped in every way that he could help, and Miss Maggie told him that he was a great comfort, and that she did not know what she would have done without him. Miss Flora and Mr. James Blaisdell helped too, in every way possible, and at last the first hard, sad days were over, and the household had settled back into something like normal conditions again. Miss Maggie had more time now, and she went often to drive or for motor rides with Mr. Smith. Together they explored cemeteries for miles around, and although Miss Maggie worried sometimes because they found so little Blaisdell data, Mr. Smith did not seem to mind it at all. In September, Miss Flora moved into an attractive house on the west side, bought some new furniture, and installed a maid in the kitchen, all under Miss Maggie's kindly supervision. In September, too, Frank and Jane Blaisdell came home, and the young people began to prepare for the coming school year. Mr. Smith met Mrs. Hattie one day coming out of Miss Maggie's gate. She smiled and greeted him cordially, but she looked so palpably upset over something that he exclaimed to Miss Maggie as soon as he entered the house, "What is it? Is anything the matter with Mrs. James Blaisdell?" Miss Maggie smiled, but she frowned, too. "No, oh no, except that Hattie has discovered that $100,000 isn't $1 million. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, where she's been this summer, she's measured up, of course, with people a great deal richer than she. And she doesn't like it. Here in Hillerton, her $100 and $200 dresses looked very grand to her. But she's discovered that there are women who pay $500 and $1,000 and even more. She feels very cheap and poverty-stricken now, therefore, in her $200 gowns. Poor Hattie! If she only would stop trying to live like somebody else." "But I thought this money was making them happy," stammered Mr. Smith. "It was, until she realized that somebody else had more," sighed Miss Maggie with a shake of her head. "Oh, well, she'll get over that." "Perhaps. At any rate, it's brought her husband some comfort." "Yes, it has, but—" "What do you mean by that?" he demanded, when she did not finish her sentence. "I was wondering if it would bring him any more." "They haven't lost it." "Oh, no, but they've spent a lot. And Hattie is beginning again her old talk that she must have more money in order to live even decent. It sounds very familiar to me, and to Jim, I suspect, poor fellow. I saw him the other night, and from what he said, and what she says, I can see pretty well how things are going. She's trying to get some of her rich friends to give Jim a better position where he'll earn more. She doesn't understand either why Jim can't go into the stock market and make millions, as some men do. I'm afraid she isn't always patient. She says there are Fred and Elizabeth and Benjamin to educate, and that she's just got to have more money to tide them over till the rest of the legacy comes." "The rest of the legacy?" exploded Mr. Smith. "Good heavens! Does that woman think that—" Mr. Smith stopped with the air of one pulling himself back from an abyss. Miss Maggie laughed. "I don't wonder you exclaim. It is funny, the way she takes that for granted, isn't it? Still, there are grounds for it, of course." "Oh, are there? Do you think she'll get more, then?" demanded Mr. Smith, almost savagely. Miss Maggie laughed again. "I don't know what to think. To my mind, the whole thing was rather extraordinary anyway, that he should have given them anything, utter strangers as they were. Still, as Hattie says, as long as he has recognized their existence, why, he may again, of course. Still, on the other hand, he may have very reasonably argued that, having willed them 100,000 apiece, that was quite enough, and he'd give the rest somewhere else." "Humph, maybe," grunted Mr. Smith. "And he may come back alive from South America." "He may." "But Hattie isn't counting on either of these contingencies, and she is counting on the money," sighed Miss Maggie, sobering again. "And Jim, poor Jim, I'm afraid he's going to find it just as hard to keep caught up now as he used to." "Humph!" Mr. Smith frowned. He did not speak again. He stood looking out of the window, apparently in deep thought. Miss Maggie, with another sigh, turned and went out into the kitchen. The next day on the street, Mr. Smith met Millicent Blaisdell. She was with a tall, manly-looking, square-jawed young fellow whom Mr. Smith had never seen before. Millicent smiled and blushed adorably. Then, to his surprise, she stopped him with a gesture. "Mr. Smith, I know it's on the street, but I want Mr. Gray to meet you, and I want you to meet Mr. Gray. Mr. Smith is a very good friend of mine, Donald." Mr. Smith greeted Donald Gray with a warm handshake and a keen glance into his face. The blush, the hesitation, the shy happiness in Millicent's eyes had been unmistakable. Mr. Smith felt suddenly that Donald Gray was a man he very much wanted to know a good deal about. He chatted affably for a minute. Then he went home and straight to Miss Maggie. "Who's Donald Gray, please?" he demanded. Miss Maggie laughed and threw up her hands. "Oh, these children!" "But who is he?" "Well, to begin with, he's devoted to Millicent." "You don't have to tell me that. I've seen him and Millicent." "Oh!" Miss Maggie smiled appreciatively. "What I want to know is, who is he?" "He's a young man whom Millicent met this summer. He plays the violin, and Millicent played his accompaniments in a church entertainment. That's where she met him first. He's the son of a minister near their camp, where the girls went to church. He's a fine fellow, I guess. He's hard hit, that's sure. He came to Hillerton at once, and has gone to work in Hammond's real estate office. So you see he's in earnest." "I should say he was. I liked his appearance very much." "Yes, I did. But her mother doesn't." "What do you mean? She objects?" "Decidedly. She says he's worse than Carl Pennock, that he hasn't got any money, not any money." "Money!" ejaculated Mr. Smith in genuine amazement. "You don't mean that she's really letting money stand in the way if Millicent cares for him? Why, it was only a year ago that she herself was bitterly censuring Mrs. Pennock for doing exactly the same thing in the case of young Pennock and Millicent." "I know," nodded Miss Maggie. "But she seems to have forgotten that." "Shoes on the other foot this time." "It seems to be." Muttered Mr. Smith. "I don't think Jane has done much yet by way of opposition. You see, they've only reached home, and she's just found out about it. But she told me she shouldn't let it go on, not for a moment. She has other plans for Millicent." "Shall I be meddling in what isn't my business, if I ask what they are?" queried Mr. Smith diffidently. "You know I am very much interested in Miss Millicent." "Not a bit. I'm glad to have you. Perhaps you can suggest a way out for us," sighed Miss Maggie. "The case is just this. Jane wants Millicent to marry Hibbert Gaylord." "Shucks! I've seen young Gray only once, but I'd give more for his little finger than I would for a cart-load of Gaylords," flung out Mr. Smith. "So would I," approved Miss Maggie. "But Jane—well, Jane feels otherwise. To begin with, she's very much flattered at Gaylord's attentions to Millicent, the more so because he's left Bessie—I beg her pardon, Elizabeth—for her." "Then Miss Elizabeth is in it, too?" "Very much in it. That's one of the reasons why Hattie is so anxious for more money. She wants clothes and jewels for Bessie so she can keep pace with the Gaylords. You see, there's a wheel within a wheel here." "I should say there was." "As near as I can judge, young Gaylord is Bessie's devoted slave—until Millicent arrives. Then he has eyes only for her, which piques Bessie and her mother not a little. They were together more or less all summer, and I think Hattie thought the match was as good as made. Now, once in Hillerton, back he flies to Millicent." "And Millicent?" Miss Maggie's eyes became gravely troubled. "I don't understand Millicent. I think—no, I know she cares for young Gray. But—well, I might as well admit it. She is ready any time to flirt outrageously with Hibbert Gaylord, or with anybody else for that matter. I saw her flirting with you at the party last Christmas." Miss Maggie's face showed a sudden pink blush. Mr. Smith gave a hearty laugh. "Don't you worry, Miss Maggie. If she'll flirt with young Gaylord and others, it's all right. There's safety in numbers, you know." "But I don't like to have her flirt at all, Mr. Smith." "It isn't flirting. It's just her bottled-up childhood and youth bubbling over. She can't help bubbling, she's been repressed so long. She'll come out all right, and she won't come out hand in hand with Hibbert Gaylord. You see if she does." Miss Maggie shook her head and sighed. "You don't know Jane. Jane will never give up. She'll be quiet, but she'll be firm. With one hand she'll keep Gray away, and with the other she'll push Gaylord forward. Even Millicent herself won't know how it's done. But it'll be done, and I tremble for the consequences." Mr. Smith's eyes had lost their twinkle now. To himself he muttered, "I wonder if maybe I hadn't better take a hand in this thing myself." "You said? I didn't understand what you said," murmured Miss Maggie doubtfully. "Nothing, Miss Maggie," replied the man. Then, with business-like alertness, he lifted his chin. "How long do you say this has been going on?" "Why, especially since they all came home 2 weeks ago. Jane knew nothing of Donald Gray till then." "Where does Carl Pennock come in?" Miss Maggie gave a gesture of despair. "Oh, he comes in anywhere that he can find a chance. Though, to do her justice, Millicent doesn't give him many chances." What does her father say to all this? How does he like young Gray?" Miss Maggie gave another gesture of despair. "He says nothing, or rather he laughs and says, 'Oh, well, it will come out all right in time. Young folks will be young folks.'" "But does he like Gray? He knows him, of course." "Oh, yes, he likes him. He's taken him to ride in his car once, to my knowledge." "His car? Then Mr. Frank Blaisdell has a car?" "Oh, yes. He's just been learning to run it. Jane says he's crazy over it, and that he's teasing her to go all the time. She says he wants to be on the move somewhere every minute. He's taken up golf, too. Did you know that?" "Well, no, I didn't." "Oh, yes. He's joined the Hillerton Country Club, and he goes up to the links every morning for practice." "I can't imagine it. Frank Blaisdell spending his mornings playing golf." "You forget," smiled Miss Maggie. "Frank Blaisdell is a retired businessman. He has begun to take some pleasure in life now." "Humph," muttered Mr. Smith as he turned to go into his own room. Mr. Smith called on the Frank Blaisdells that evening. Mr. Blaisdell took him out to the garage, very lately a barn, and showed him the shining new car. He also showed him his lavish supply of golf clubs, and told him what a bully time he was having these days. He told him, too, all about his Western trip, and said there was nothing like travel to broaden a man's outlook. He said a great deal about how glad he was to get out of the old grind behind the counter. But in the next breath he asked Mr. Smith if he had ever seen a store run down as his had done since he left it. Donovan didn't know any more than a cat how such a store should be run, he said. When they came back from the garage, they found callers in the living room. Carl Pennock and Hibbert Gaylord were chatting with Millicent. Almost at once the doorbell rang too, and Donald Gray came in with his violin and a roll of music. Millicent's mother came in also. She greeted all the young men pleasantly, and asked Carl Pennock to tell Mr. Smith all about his fishing trip. Then she sat down by young Gray and asked him many questions about his music. She was so interested in violins, she said. Gray waxed eloquent and seemed wonderfully pleased. For about 5 minutes. Then Mr. Smith saw that his glance was shifting more and more frequently, and more unhappily to Millicent and Hibbert Gaylord, talking tennis across the room. Mr. Smith apparently lost interest in young Pennock's fish story then. At all events, another minute found him eagerly echoing Mrs. Blaisdell's interest in violins, but with this difference. Violins in the abstract with her became a violin in the concrete with him, and he must hear it at once. Mrs. Jane herself could not have told exactly how it was done, but she knew that 2 minutes later young Gray and Millicent were at the piano. He, shining-eyed and happy, drawing a tentative bow across the strings. She, no less shining-eyed and happy, giving him A on the piano. Mr. Smith enjoyed the music very much, so much that he begged for another selection, and yet another. Mr. Smith did not appear to realize that Messrs. Pennock and Gaylord were passing through sham interest and frank boredom to disgusted silence. Equally oblivious was he of Mrs. Jane's efforts to substitute some other form of entertainment for the violin playing. He shook hands very heartily, however, with Pennock and Gaylord when they took their somewhat haughty departure a little later, and, strange to say, his interest in the music seemed to go with their going. For at once then he turned to Mr. and Mrs. Frank Blaisdell, with a very animated account of some Blaisdell data he had found only the week before. He did not appear to notice that the music of the piano had become nothing but soft, fitful snatches, with a great deal of low talk and laughter between. He seemed interested only that Mr. Blaisdell, and especially Mrs. Blaisdell, should know the intimate history of one Ephraim Blaisdell, born in 1720, and his 10 children and 49 grandchildren. He talked of various investments then, and of the weather. He talked of the Blaisdells' trip, and of the cost of railroad fares and hotel life. He talked. Indeed, Mrs. Jane told her husband after he left that Mr. Smith had talked of everything under the sun, and that she nearly had a fit because she could not get 1 minute to herself to break in upon Millicent and that horrid Gray fellow at the piano. She had not supposed Mr. Smith could talk like that. She had never remembered he was such a talker. The young people had a tennis match on the school tennis court the next day. Mr. Smith told Miss Maggie that he thought he would drop around there. He said he liked very much to watch tennis games. Miss Maggie said yes, that she liked to watch tennis games too. If this was just a wee bit of a hint, it quite failed of its purpose, for Mr. Smith did not offer to take her with him. He changed the subject, indeed, so abruptly that Miss Maggie bit her lip and flushed a little, throwing a swift glance into his apparently serene countenance. Miss Maggie herself in the afternoon, with an errand for an excuse, walked slowly by the tennis court. She saw Mr. Smith at once, but he did not seem at all interested in the playing. He had his back to the court, in fact. He was talking very animatedly with Millicent Blaisdell. He was still talking with her, though on the opposite side of the court, when Miss Maggie went by again on her way home. Miss Maggie frowned and said something just under her breath about that child flirting as usual. Then she went on, walking very fast, and without another glance toward the tennis ground. But a little farther on Miss Maggie's step lagged perceptibly, and her head lost its proud poise. Miss Maggie, for a reason she could not have explained herself, was feeling suddenly old and weary and very much alone. To the image in the mirror as she took off her hat a few minutes later in her own hall, she said scornfully, "Well, why shouldn't you feel old? You are old. You are old." Miss Maggie had a habit of talking to herself in the mirror, but never before had she said anything like this to herself. An hour later Mr. Smith came home to supper. "Well, how did the game go?" queried Miss Maggie, without looking up from the stocking she was mending. "Game? Go? Oh! Why, I don't remember who did win finally," he answered. Nor did it apparently occur to him that for one who was so greatly interested in tennis, he was curiously uninformed. It did occur to Miss Maggie, however. The next day Mr. Smith left the house soon after breakfast, and contrary to his usual custom, did not mention where he was going. Miss Maggie was surprised and displeased. More especially was she displeased because she was displeased. As if it mattered to her where he went, she told herself scornfully. The next day and the next it was much the same. On the third day she saw Jane. "Where's Mr. Smith?" demanded Jane without preamble, glancing at the vacant chair by the table in the corner. Miss Maggie, to her disgust, could feel the color burning in her cheeks, but she managed to smile as if amused. "I don't know, I'm sure. I'm not Mr. Smith's keeper, Jane." "Well, if you were, I should ask you to keep him away from Millicent," retorted Mrs. Jane tartly. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's been hanging around Millicent almost every day for a week." Miss Maggie flushed painfully. "Nonsense, Jane. He's more than twice her age. Mr. Smith is 50 if he's a day." "I'm not saying he isn't," sniffed Jane, her nose up-tilted. "But I do say, no fool like an old fool." "Nonsense," scorned Miss Maggie again. "Mr. Smith has always been fond of Millicent, and interested in her. But I don't believe he cares for her that way." "Then why does he come to see her and take her auto riding, and hang around her every minute he gets a chance?" snapped Jane. "I know how he acts at the house, and I hear he scarcely left her side at the tennis match the other day." "Yes, Miss Maggie did not finish her sentence. A slow change came to her countenance. The flush receded, leaving her face a bit white. "I wonder if the man really thinks he stands any chance," spluttered Jane, ignoring Miss Maggie's unfinished sentence. "Why, he's worse than that Donald Gray. He not only hasn't got the money, but he's old as well." "Yes, we're all getting old, Jane." Miss Maggie tossed the words off lightly, and smiled as she uttered them. But after Mrs. Jane had gone, she went to the little mirror above the mantel, and gazed at herself long and fixedly. "Well, what if he does? It's nothing to you, Maggie Duff," she muttered under her breath. Then resolutely she turned away, picked up her work, and fell to sewing very fast. 2 days later Millicent went back to school. Bessie went too. Fred and Benny had already gone. To Miss Maggie, things seemed to settle back into their old ways again then. With Mr. Smith she took drives and motor rides, enjoying the crisp October air and the dancing sunlight on the reds and browns and yellows of the autumnal foliage. True, she used to wonder sometimes if the end always justified the means. It seemed an expensive business to hire an automobile to take them 50 miles and back, and all to verify a single date. And she could not help noticing that Mr. Smith appeared to have many dates that needed verifying, dates that were located in very diverse parts of the surrounding country. Miss Maggie also could not help noticing that Mr. Smith was getting very little new material for his Blaisdell book these days, though he still worked industriously over the old, retabulating and recopying. She knew this because she helped him do it, though she was careful to let him know that she recognized the names and dates of old acquaintances. To tell the truth, Miss Maggie did not like to admit, even to herself, that Mr. Smith must be nearing the end of his task. She did not like to think of the house after Mr. Smith should have gone. She told herself that he was just the sort of homey boarder that she liked, and she wished she might keep him indefinitely. She thought so all the more when the long evenings of November brought a new pleasure. Mr. Smith fell into the way of bringing home books to read aloud, and she enjoyed that very much. They had long talks, too, over the books they read. In one there was an old man who fell in love with a young girl and married her. Miss Maggie, as certain parts of this story were read, held her breath, and stole furtive glances into Mr. Smith's face. When it was finished, she contrived to question with careful casualness as to his opinion of such a marriage. Mr. Smith's answer was prompt and unequivocal. He said he did not believe that such a marriage should take place, nor did he believe that in real life it would result in happiness. Marriage should be between persons of similar age, tastes, and habits, he said very decidedly. And Miss Maggie blushed and said, "Yes, yes, indeed." And that night, when Miss Maggie gazed at herself in the glass, she looked so happy that she appeared to be almost as young as Millicent herself. End of Chapter 16. Recording by Linda Lee Paquette. Chapter 17 of Oh, Money, Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Lee Paquette. Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 17. An Ambassador of Cupid's. Christmas again brought all the young people home for the holidays. It brought also a Christmas party at James Blaisdell's home. It was a very different party, however, from the housewarming of a year before. To begin with, the attendance was much smaller. Mrs. Hattie had been very exclusive in her invitations this time. She had not invited everybody who ever went anywhere. There were champagne and cigarettes for the ladies, too. As before, Mr. Smith and Miss Maggie went together. Miss Maggie, who had not attended any social gathering since Father Duff died, yielded to Mr. Smith's urgings and said that she would go to this. But Miss Maggie wished afterward that she had not gone. There were so many features about that party that Miss Maggie did not like. She did not like the champagne nor the cigarettes. She did not like Bessie's showy, low-cut dress, nor her supercilious airs. She did not like the look in Fred's eyes, nor the way he drank the champagne. She did not like Jane's manoeuvres to bring Millicent and Hibbert Gaylord into each other's company, nor the way Mr. Smith manoeuvred to get Millicent for himself. Of all these, except the very last, Miss Maggie talked with Mr. Smith on the way home, yet it was the very last that was uppermost in her mind, except perhaps Fred. She did speak of Fred, but because that too was so much to her, she waited until the last before she spoke of it. "You saw Fred, of course," she began then. "Yes." Short as the word was, it carried a volume of meaning to Miss Maggie's fearful ears. She turned to him quickly. "Mr. Smith, it isn't true, is it?" "I'm afraid it is." "You saw him drinking, then?" "Yes, I saw some. And I heard more. It's just as I feared. He's got in with Gaylord and the rest of his set at college, and they're a bad lot. Drinking, gambling, no good." "But Fred wouldn't gamble, Mr. Smith. Oh, Fred wouldn't do that. And he's so ambitious to get ahead. Surely he'd know he couldn't get anywhere in his studies if he drank and gambled." "It would seem so." "Did you see his father? I saw him only a minute at the first, and he didn't look well a bit to me." "Yes, I saw him. I found him in his den just as I did last year. He didn't look well to me either." "Did he say anything about Fred?" "Not a word. And that's what worries me the most. Last year he talked a lot about him and was so proud and happy in his coming success. This time he never mentioned him, but he looked bad." "What did he talk about?" "Oh, books, business. Nothing in particular. And he wasn't interested in what he did say. He was very different from last year." "Yes, I know. He is different," sighed Maggie. "He's talked with me quite a lot about the way they're living. He doesn't like so much fuss and show and society." Mr. Smith frowned. "But I thought Mrs. Hattie would get over all that by this time, after the newness of the money was worn off." "I hoped she would. But she doesn't. It's worse, if anything," sighed Miss Maggie, as they ascended the steps at her own door. Mr. Smith frowned again. "And Miss Bessie," he began disapprovingly, then stopped. "Now, Miss Millicent," he resumed, in a very different voice. But Miss Maggie was not apparently listening. With a rather loud rattling of the doorknob, she was pushing open the door. "Why, how hot it is! Did I leave that damper open?" she cried, hurrying into the living-room. And Mr. Smith, hurrying after, evidently forgot to finish his sentence. Miss Maggie did not attend any more of the merrymakings of that holiday week. But Mr. Smith did. It seemed to Miss Maggie, indeed, that Mr. Smith was away nearly every minute of that long week, and it was a long week to Miss Maggie. Even the Martin girls were away many of the evenings. Miss Maggie told herself that that was why the house seemed so lonesome. But though Miss Maggie did not participate in the gay doings, she heard of them. She heard of them on all sides except from Mr. Smith, and on all sides she heard of the devotion of Mr. Smith to Miss Millicent. She concluded that this was the reason why Mr. Smith himself was so silent. Miss Maggie was shocked and distressed. She was also very much puzzled. She had supposed that Mr. Smith understood that Millicent and young Gray cared for each other, and she had thought that Mr. Smith even approved of the affair between them. Now to push himself on the scene in this absurd fashion, and try to cut everybody out, as it was vulgarly termed. She never would have believed it of Mr. Smith in the world. And she was disappointed, too. She liked Mr. Smith very much. She had considered him to be a man of good sense and good judgment, and had he not himself said not so long ago that he believed lovers should be of the same age, tastes, and habits? And yet here now he was. And there could be no mistake about it. Everybody was saying the same thing. The Martin girls brought it home as current gossip. Jane was highly exercised over it, and even Harriet had exclaimed over the shameful flirtation Millicent was carrying on with that man old enough to be her father. No, there was no mistake. Besides, did she not see with her own eyes that Mr. Smith was gone every day and evening, and that, when he was at home at meal-time, he was silent and preoccupied, and not like himself at all? And it was such a pity. She had thought so much of Mr. Smith. It really made her feel quite ill. And Miss Maggie looked ill on the last evening of that holiday week when, at 9 o'clock, Mr. Smith found her sitting idle-handed before the stove in the living-room. "Why, Miss Maggie, what's the matter with you?" cried the man, in very evident concern. "You don't look like yourself tonight." Miss Maggie pulled herself up hastily. "Nonsense! I'm perfectly well. I'm just tired, I guess. You're home early, Mr. Smith." In spite of herself, Miss Maggie's voice carried a tinge of something not quite pleasant. Mr. Smith, however, did not appear to notice it. "Yes, I'm home early for once, thank heaven," he half groaned, as he dropped himself into a chair. "It has been a strenuous week for you, hasn't it?" Again, the tinge of something not quite pleasant in Miss Maggie's voice. "Yes, but it's been worth it." "Of course." Mr. Smith turned deliberately and looked at Miss Maggie. There was a vague questioning in his eyes. Obtaining apparently, however, no satisfactory answer from Miss Maggie's placid countenance, He turned away and began speaking again. "Well, anyway, I've accomplished what I set out to do." You've already accomplished it?" faltered Miss Maggie. She was gazing at him now with startled, half-frightened eyes. "Yes." "Why, Miss Maggie, what's the matter? What makes you look so queer?" "Queer? Nonsense. Why, nothing. Nothing at all," laughed Miss Maggie nervously, but very gaily. "I may have been a little surprised for a moment, but I'm very glad, very." "Glad?" "Why, yes, for you. Isn't one always glad when a love affair is all settled?" "Oh, then you suspected it." Mr. Smith smiled pleasantly, but without embarrassment. "It doesn't matter, of course, only, well, I had hoped it wasn't too conspicuous." "Oh, but you couldn't expect to hide a thing like that, Mr. Smith," retorted Miss Maggie, with what was very evidently intended for an arch smile. "I heard it everywhere. Everywhere." "The mischief you did!" frowned Mr. Smith, looking slightly annoyed. "Well, I suppose I couldn't expect to keep a thing like that entirely in the dark. Still, I don't believe the parties themselves quite understood. Of course Pennock and Gaylord knew that they were kept effectually away, but I don't believe they realized just how systematically it was done. Of course Gray understood from the first." "Poor Mr. Gray. I can't help being sorry for him." "Sorry for him?" "Certainly. And I should think you might give him a little sympathy," rejoined Miss Maggie spiritedly. "You know how much he cared for Millicent." Mr. Smith sat suddenly erect in his chair. "Cared for her? Sympathy? Why, what in the world are you talking about? Wasn't I doing the best I could for them all the time? Of course it kept him away from her, too, just as it did Pennock and Gaylord, but he understood. Besides, he had her part of the time. I let him in whenever it was possible." "Let him in?" Miss Maggie was sitting erect now. "Whatever in the world are you talking about? Do you mean to say you were doing this for Mr. Gray all the time?" "Why, of course. Whom else should I do it for? You didn't suppose it was for Pennock or Gaylord, did you? Nor for—" He stopped short and stared at Miss Maggie in growing amazement and dismay. You didn't think I was doing that for myself?" "Well, of course, I—" Miss Maggie was laughing and blushing painfully, but there was a new light in her eyes. "Well, anyway, everybody said you were," she defended herself stoutly. "Oh, good heavens!" Mr. Smith leaped to his feet and thrust his hands into his pockets as he took a nervous turn about the room. "For myself, indeed! As if, in my position, How perfectly absurd!" He wheeled and faced her irritably. "And you believed that? Why, I'm not a marrying man. I never saw the woman yet that I—" With his eyes on Miss Maggie's flushed, half-averted face, he stopped again abruptly. "Well, I'll be—" Even under his breath he did not finish his sentence, but with a new, quite different expression on his face, he resumed his nervous pacing of the room, throwing now and then a quick glance at Miss Maggie's still averted face. It was absurd, of course, wasn't it? Miss Maggie stirred and spoke lightly, with the obvious intention of putting matters back into usual conditions again. But come, tell me, just what did you do and how? I'm so interested. Indeed I am. Eh? What? Mr. Smith spoke as if he was thinking of something else entirely. Oh, that. Mr. Smith sat down, but he did not go on speaking at once. His eyes frowningly regarded the stove. You said you kept Pennock and Gaylord away, Miss Maggie hopefully reminded him. Yes. Oh, it was really very simple. I just monopolized Millicent myself when I couldn't let Donald have her. That's all. I saw very soon that she couldn't cope with her mother alone, and Gaylord, well, I've no use for that young gentleman. But you like Donald? Very much. I've been looking him up for some time. He's all right. I'm glad. Yes. Mr. Smith spoke abstractedly, without enthusiasm. Plainly, Mr. Smith was still thinking of something else. Miss Maggie asked other questions. Miss Maggie was manifestly interested, and Mr. Smith answered them, but still without enthusiasm. Very soon he said good night and went to his own room. For some days after this, Mr. Smith did not appear at all like himself. He seemed abstracted and puzzled. Miss Maggie, who still felt self-conscious and embarrassed over her misconception of his attentions to Millicent, was more talkative than usual in her nervous attempt to appear perfectly natural. The fact that she often found his eyes fixed thoughtfully upon her, and felt them following her as she moved about the room, did not tend to make her more at ease. At such times she talked faster than ever, usually, if possible, about some member of the Blaisdell family. Miss Maggie had learned that Mr. Smith was always interested in any bit of news about the Blaisdells. It was on such an occasion that she told him about Miss Flora and the new house. "I don't know really what I am going to do with her," she said. "I wonder if perhaps you could help me." "Help you? About Miss Flora?" "Yes. Can you think of any way to make her contented?" "Contented? Why, I thought— Don't tell me she isn't happy." There was a curious note of almost despair in Mr. Smith's voice. "Hasn't she a new house and everything nice to go with it?" Miss Maggie laughed. Then she sighed. "Oh, yes, and that's what's the trouble. They're too nice. She feels smothered and oppressed, as if she were visiting somewhere and not at home. She's actually afraid of her maid. You see, Miss Flora has always lived very simply. She isn't used to maids, and the maid knows it, which, if you ever employed maids, you would know is a terrible state of affairs." "Oh, but she'll get used to that in time." "Perhaps," conceded Miss Maggie, "but I doubt it. Some women would, but not Miss Flora. She is too inherently simple in her tastes. Why, it's as bad as always living in a hotel," she wailed to me last night. "You know, on my trip I was so afraid always I'd do something that wasn't quite right before those awful waiters in the dining rooms, and I was anticipating so much getting home where I could act natural, and here I've got one in my own house." Mr. Smith frowned, but he laughed too. "Poor Miss Flora! But why doesn't she dismiss the lady?" "She doesn't dare to. Besides, there's Hattie. She says Hattie is always telling her what is due her position, and that she must do this and do that. She's being invited out, too, to the Pennocks and the Bensons, and they're worse than the maid, she declares. She says she loves to run in and see people, and she loves to go to places and spend the day with her sewing. But that these things where you go and stand up and eat off a jiggly plate and see everybody and not really see anybody are a nuisance and an abomination. "Well, she's about right there," chuckled Mr. Smith. "Yes, I think she is," smiled Miss Maggie. "But that isn't telling me how to make her contented." "Contented? Great Scott!" snapped Mr. Smith, with an irritability that was as sudden as it was apparently causeless. "I didn't suppose you had to tell any woman on this earth how to be contented with $100,000. "It would seem so, wouldn't it?" Something in Miss Maggie's voice sent Mr. Smith's eyes to her face in a keen glance of interrogation. "You mean you'd like the chance to prove it? That you wish you had that 100,000? "Oh, I didn't say that," twinkled Miss Maggie mischievously, turning away. It was that same afternoon that Mr. Smith met Mrs. Jane Blaisdell on the street. "You're just the man I want to see," she accosted him eagerly. "Then I'll turn and walk along with you, if I may," smiled Mr. Smith. "What can I do for you?" "Well, I don't know as you can do anything," she sighed. "But somebody's got to do something. Do you suppose you could interest my husband in this Blaisdell business of yours?" Mr. Smith gave a start, looking curiously disconcerted. "Blaisdell business?" he stammered. "Why, I thought he was interested in motoring and golf." "Oh, he was for a time, but it's too cold for those now, and he got sick of them anyway before it did come cold, just as he does of everything. Well, yesterday he asked a question, something about Father Blaisdell's mother, and that gave me the idea. Do you suppose you could get him interested in this ancestor business? Oh, I wish you could. It's so nice and quiet, and it can't cost much. Not like golf clubs and caddies and gasoline, anyway. Do you think you could?" "Why, I don't know Mrs. Blaisdell," murmured Mr. Smith, still a little worriedly. I could show him what I have found, of course." "Well, I wish you would, then. Anyway, something's got to be done," she sighed. "He's nervous as a witch. He can't keep still a minute, and he isn't a bit well either. He ate such a lot of rich food and all sorts of stuff on our trip that he got his stomach all out of order, and now he can't eat anything hardly." "Humph. Well, if his stomach's knocked out, I pity him," nodded Mr. Smith. "I've been there." "Oh, have you? Oh, yes, I remember. You did say so when you first came, didn't you? But, Mr. Smith, please, if you know any of those health fads, don't tell them to my husband. Don't, I beg of you. He's tried dozens of them until I'm nearly wild, and I've lost 2 hired girls already. One day it'll be no water, and the next it'll be all he can drink. And one week he won't eat anything but vegetables, and the next he won't touch a thing but meat, and— is it fruit that goes with meat, or cereals? Well, never mind. Whatever it is, he's done it. And lately he's taken to inspecting every bit of meat and groceries that comes into the house. Why, he spends half his time in the kitchen, nosing round the cupboards and refrigerator. And of course, no girl will stand that. That's why I'm hoping— Oh, I am hoping that you can do something with him on that ancestor business. There, here's the Bensons, where I've got to stop. And thank you ever so much, Mr. Smith, if you will." "All right, I'll try," promised Mr. Smith dubiously, as he lifted his hat. But he frowned, and he was still frowning when he met Miss Maggie at the Duff supper-table half an hour later. "Well, I've found another one who wants me to tell to be contented, though afflicted with $100,000, he greeted her glowingly. "Is that so?" smiled Miss Maggie. "Yes. Can't $100,000 bring anyone satisfaction?" Miss Maggie laughed. Then into her eyes came the mischievous twinkle that Mr. Smith had learned to watch for. "Don't blame the poor money," she said then demurely. "Blame the way it is spent." End of Chapter 17. Recording by Linda Lee Paquette. Chapter 18 of Oh, Money, Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Lee Paquette. Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 18. Just a Matter of Begging. True to his promise, Mr. Smith tried Mr. Frank Blaisdell on the ancestor business very soon. Laboriously he got out his tabulated dates and names, and carefully he traced for him several lines of descent from remote ancestors. Painstakingly he pointed out a Submit who had no history but the bare fact of her marriage to one Thomas Blaisdell, and a Thankful Marsh, who had eluded his every attempt to supply her with parents. He let it be understood how important these missing links were, and he tried to inspire his possible pupil with a frenzied desire to go out and dig them up. He showed some of the interesting letters he had received from various Blaisdells far and near, and he spread before him the genealogical page of his latest transcript, and explained how one might there stumble upon the very missing link he was looking for. But Mr. Frank Blaisdell was openly bored. He said he didn't care how many children his great-grandfather had, nor what they died of. And as for Mrs. Submit and Miss Thankful, the ladies might bury themselves in the transcript, or hide behind that wall of dates and names till doomsday, for all he cared. He shouldn't disturb 'em. He never did like figures, he said, except figures that represented something worthwhile, like a day's sales or a year's profits. And speaking of grocery stores, had Mr. Smith ever seen a store run down as his old one had since he sold out? For that matter, something must have got into all the grocery stores, for a poorer lot of goods than those delivered every day at his home he never saw. It was a disgrace to the trade. He said a good deal more about his grocery store, but nothing whatever more about his Blaisdell ancestors. So Mr. Smith felt justified in considering his efforts to interest Mr. Frank Blaisdell in the ancestor business a failure. Certainly he never tried it again. It was in February that a certain metropolitan reporter, short for feature articles, ran up to Hillerton and contributed to his paper the following Sunday a write-up on the Blaisdells 1 year after, enlarging on the fine new homes, the motor cars, and the luxurious living of the three families. And it was 3 days after this article was printed that Miss Flora appeared at Miss Maggie's, breathless with excitement. "Just see what I've got in the mail this morning," she cried to Miss Maggie and to Mr. Smith, who had opened the door for her. With trembling fingers she took from her bag a letter, and a small picture evidently cut from a newspaper. "There, see?" she panted, holding them out. "It's a man in Boston, and these are his children. There are 7 of them. He wrote me a beautiful letter. He said he knew I must have a real kind heart, and he's in terrible trouble. He said he saw in the paper about the wonderful legacy I'd had, and he told his wife he was going to write to me to see if I wouldn't help them, if only a little. It would aid them that much." "He wants money, then?" Miss Maggie had taken the letter and the picture rather gingerly in her hands. Mr. Smith had gone over to the stove suddenly, to turn a damper apparently, though a close observer might have noticed that he turned it back to its former position almost at once. "Yes," palpitated Miss Flora. "He's sick, and he lost his position, and his wife's sick, and 2 of the children, and one of 'em's lame, and another's blind. Oh, it was such a pitiful story, Maggie. Why, some days they haven't had enough to eat, and just look at me, with all my chickens and turkeys and more pudding every day than I can stuff down." "Did he give you any references?" "References? What do you mean? He didn't ask me to hire him for anything." No, dear, but I mean, did he give you any references to show that he was worthy and all right?" explained Miss Maggie patiently. "Of course he didn't. Why, he didn't need to. He told me himself how things were with him," rebuked Miss Flora indignantly. "It's all in the letter there. Read for yourself." "But he really ought to have given you some reference, dear, if he asked you for money." "Well, I don't want any reference. I believe him. I'd be ashamed to doubt a man like that. And you would, after you read that letter, and looked into those blessed children's faces. Besides, he never thought of such a thing. I know he didn't. Why, he says right in the letter there that he never asked for help before, and he was so ashamed that he had to now." Mr. Smith made a sudden odd little noise in his throat. Perhaps he got choked. At all events, he was seized with a fit of coughing just then. Miss Maggie turned over the letter in her hand. "Where does he tell you to send the money?" "It's right there, box 400 and something, and I got a money order, just as he said." "You got one? Do you mean that you've already sent this money?" cried Miss Maggie. "Why, yes, of course. I stopped at the office on the way down here." "And you sent a money order?" "Yes. He said he would rather have that than a check." "I don't doubt it. You don't seem to have delayed any." "Of course I didn't delay. Why, Maggie, he said he had to have it at once. He was going to be turned out into the streets. Think of those 7 little children in the streets. Wait, indeed. Why, Maggie, what can you be thinking of?" "I'm thinking you've been the easy victim of a professional beggar, Flora," retorted Miss Maggie, with some spirit, handing back the letter and the picture. "Why, Maggie, I never knew you to be so unkind," charged Miss Flora, her eyes tearful. "He can't be a professional beggar. He said he wasn't, that he never begged before in his life." Miss Maggie, with a despairing gesture, averted her face. Miss Flora turned to Mr. Smith. "Mr. Smith, you don't think so, do you?" she pleaded. Mr. Smith grew very red, perhaps because he had to stop to cough again. "Well, Miss Flora, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I shall have to agree with Miss Maggie here, to some extent." "But you didn't read the letter. You don't know how beautifully he talked." "You told me, and you say yourself that he gave you only a post-office box for an address, so you see you couldn't look him up very well." "I don't need to." Miss Flora threw back her head a little haughtily. "And I'm glad I don't doubt my fellow men and women as you and Maggie Duff do. If either of you knew what you're talking about, I wouldn't say anything. But you don't. You can't know anything about this man, and you didn't ever get letters like this, either of you, of course. But anyhow, I don't care if he ain't worthy. I wouldn't let those children suffer, and I'm glad I sent it. I never in my life was so happy as I was on the way here from the post office this morning." Without waiting for a reply, she turned away majestically, but at the door she paused and looked back at Miss Maggie. "And let me tell you that, however good or bad this particular man may be, it's given me an idea anyway," she choked. The haughtiness was all gone now. "I know now why it hasn't seemed right to be so happy. It's because there are so many other folks in the world that aren't happy. Why, my chicken and turkey would choke me now if I didn't give some of it to all those others. And I'm going to, she reiterated as she fled from the room. As the door shut crisply, Miss Maggie turned and looked at Mr. Smith. But Mr. Smith had crossed again to the stove and was fussing with the damper. Miss Maggie, after a moment's hesitation, turned and went out into the kitchen without speaking. Mr. Smith and Miss Maggie saw very little of Miss Flora after this for some time, but they heard a good deal about her. They heard of her generous gifts to families all over town. A turkey was sent to every house on Mill Street without exception, and so much candy given to the children that half of them were made ill, much to the distress of Miss Flora, who, it was said, promptly sent a physician to undo her work. The Dow family, hard-working and thrifty, and the Nolans, notorious for their laziness and shiftlessness, each received $100 outright. The Whalens, always with both hands metaphorically outstretched for alms, were loud in their praises of Miss Flora's great kindness of heart, but the Davises, Mrs. Jane Blaisdell's impecunious relatives, had very visible difficulty in making Miss Flora understand that gifts bestowed as she bestowed them were more welcome unmade. Every day, from one quarter or another, came stories like these to the ears of Miss Maggie and Mr. Smith, but Miss Flora was seen very seldom. Then one day, about a month later, she appeared as before at the Duff cottage, breathless and agitated, only this time, plainly, she had been crying. "Why, Flora, what in the world is the matter?" cried Miss Maggie as she hurried her visitor into a comfortable chair and began to unfasten her wraps. "I'll tell you in a minute. I came on purpose to tell you, but I want Mr. Smith, too. Oh, he ain't here, is he?" she lamented with a disappointed glance toward the vacant chair by the table in the corner. "I thought maybe he could help me some way. I won't go to Frank or Jim. They've said so many things. Oh, I did so hope Mr. Smith was here." "He is here, dear. He's in his room. He just came in. I'll call him," comforted Miss Maggie, taking off Miss Flora's veil and hat and smoothing back her hair. "But you don't want him to find you crying like this, Flora. What is it, dear?" Yes, I know, but I'm not crying. I mean, I won't any more. And I'll tell you just as soon as you get Mr. Smith. It's only that I've been so silly, I suppose. Please get Mr. Smith." "All right, dear." Miss Maggie, still with the disturbed frown between her eyebrows, summoned Mr. Smith. Then together they sat down to hear Miss Flora's story. It all started, of course, from that day I brought the letter here, from that man in Boston with 7 children, you know."
"Yes, I remember," encouraged Miss Maggie.
"Well, I did quite a lot of things after that. I was so glad and happy to discover I could do things for folks. It seemed to take away the wickedness of having so much, you know. And so I gave food and money, oh, lots of places here in town, everywhere most that I could find that anybody needed it."
"Yes, I know. We heard of the many kind things you did, dear." Miss Maggie had the air of one trying to soothe a grieved child.
"But they didn't turn out to be kind, all of 'em," quavered Miss Flora. "Some of 'em went wrong. I don't know why. I tried to do 'em all right."
"Of course you did."
"I know, but 'tain't those I came to talk about. It's the others, the letters."
"Letters?"
"Yes, I got 'em, lots of 'em, after the first one, the one you saw. First I got one, then another and another, till lately I've been getting 'em every day, most, and some days 2 or 3 at a time."
"And they all wanted money, I suppose," observed Mr. Smith. "For their sick wives and children, I suppose."
"Oh, not for children always, though it was them a good deal, but it was for different things, and such a lot of them. I never knew there could be so many kinds of such things, and I was real pleased at first that I could help, you know, in so many places."
"Then you always sent it, the money?" asked Mr. Smith.
"Oh, yes. Why, I just had to, the way they wrote. I wanted to, too. They wrote lovely letters, and real interesting ones, too. One man wanted a warm coat for his little girl, and he told me all about what hard times they'd had. Another wanted a brace for his poor little crippled boy, and he told me things. Why, I never s'posed folks could have such awful things and live. One woman just wanted to borrow $20 while she was so sick. She didn't ask me to give it to her. She wasn't a beggar. Don't you suppose I'd send her that money? Of course I would. And there was a poor blind man. He wanted money to buy a Bible in raised letters, and of course I wouldn't refuse that. Some didn't beg. They just wanted to sell things. I bought a diamond ring to help put a boy through school, and a ruby pin of a man who needed the money for bread for his children. And there was lots of 'em, too many to tell."
"And all from Boston, I presume," murmured Mr. Smith.
"Oh, no. Why, yes, they were, too, most of 'em, when you come to think of it. But how did you know?"
"Oh, I guessed it. But go on. You haven't finished."
"No, I haven't finished," moaned Miss Flora, almost crying again. "And now comes the worst of it. As I said, at first I liked it, all these letters, and I was so glad to help. But they're coming so fast now, I don't know what to do with 'em. And I never saw such a lot of things as they want. Pensions and mortgages and pianos and educations and wedding dresses and clothes to be buried in, and there were so many, and so queer, some of 'em, that I began to be afraid maybe they weren't quite honest, all of 'em, and of course I can't send to such a lot as there are now, anyway, and I was getting so worried. Besides, I got another one of those awful proposals from those dreadful men that want to marry me, as if I didn't know that was for my money. Then today, this morning, I got the worst of all."
From her bag she took an envelope and drew out a small picture of several children, cut apparently from a newspaper. "Look at that! Did you ever see that before?" she demanded. Miss Maggie scrutinized the picture. "Why, no, yes, it's the one you brought us a month ago, isn't it?" Miss Flora's eyes flashed angrily. "Indeed it ain't. The one I showed you before is in my bureau drawer at home. But I got it out this morning when this one came, and compared them, and they're just exactly alike. Exactly." "Oh, he wrote again, then. Wants more money, I suppose," frowned Miss Maggie. "No, he didn't. It ain't the same man. This man's name is Haley, and that one was Fay. But Mr. Haley says this is a picture of his children, and he says that the little girl in the corner is Katy, and she's deaf and dumb. But Mr. Fay said her name was Rosie, and that she was lame. And all the others, their names ain't the same either, and there ain't any of 'em blind. And of course I know now that one of these men is lying to me. Why, they cut them out of the same newspaper. They've got the same reading on the back. And I don't know what to believe now. And there are all those letters at home that I haven't answered yet, and they keep coming. Why, I just dread to see the postman turn down our street. And one man, he wrote twice. I didn't like his first letter and didn't answer it, and now he says if I don't send him the money, he'll tell everybody everywhere what a stingy, tightwad I am. And another man said he'd come and take it if I didn't send it, and you know how afraid of burglars I am. Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" she begged piteously. Mr. Smith said a sharp word behind his teeth. "Do?" he cried then wrathfully. "First, don't you worry another bit, Miss Flora. Second, just hand those letters over to me, every one of them. I'll attend to 'em." "To you?" gasped Miss Flora. "But how can you?" "Oh, I'll be your secretary. Most rich people have to have secretaries, you know." "But how'll you know how to answer my letters?" demanded Miss Flora dubiously. "Have you ever been a secretary?" No, not exactly a secretary. But I've had some experience with similar letters," observed Mr. Smith dryly. Miss Flora drew a long sigh. "Oh, dear, I wish you could. Do you think you can? I hoped maybe you could help me some way, but I never thought of that. Your answering 'em, I mean. I supposed everybody had to answer their own letters. How'll you know what I want to say?" Mr. Smith laughed a little. "I shan't be answering what you want to say, but what I want to say. In this case, Miss Flora, I exceed the prerogatives of the ordinary secretary just a bit, you see. But you can count on one thing. I shan't be spending any money for you." "You won't send them anything, then?" "Not a red cent." Miss Flora looked distressed. "But, Mr. Smith, I want to send some of 'em something. I want to be kind and charitable." "Of course you do, dear," spoke up Miss Maggie. "But you aren't being either kind or charitable to foster rascally fakes like that," pointing to the picture in Miss Flora's lap. "Are they all fakes, then?" "I'd stake my life on most of 'em," declared Mr. Smith. "They have all the earmarks of fakes, all right." Miss Flora stirred restlessly. "But I was having a beautiful time giving until these horrid letters began to come." "Flora, do you give because you like the sensation of giving and of receiving thanks, or because you really want to help somebody?"
asked Miss Maggie a bit wearily.
"Why, Maggie Duff, I want to help people, of course,"
almost wept Miss Flora. "Well, then, suppose you try and give so it will help them, then," said Miss Maggie. "One of the most risky things in the world, to my way of thinking, is a present of cash. Don't you think so, Mr. Smith?"
What? Yes, of course,"
stammered Mr. Smith, growing suddenly, for some unapparent reason, very much confused.
Yes, I do."
As Mr. Smith finished speaking, he threw an oddly nervous glance into Miss Maggie's face. But Miss Maggie had turned back to Miss Flora. "There, dear," she admonished her. "Now you do just as Mr. Smith says. Just hand over your letters to him for a while, and forget all about them. He'll tell you how he answers them, of course. But you won't have to worry about them any more. Besides, they'll soon stop coming, won't they, Mr. Smith?" "I think they will. They'll dwindle to a few scattering ones, anyway, after I've handled them for a while."
"Well, I should like that," sighed Miss Flora. "But can't I give anything anywhere?" she besought plaintively.
"Of course you can," cried Miss Maggie. "But I would investigate a little first, dear. Wouldn't you, Mr. Smith? Don't you believe in investigation?" Once again, before he answered, Mr. Smith threw a swiftly questioning glance into Miss Maggie's face.
"Yes, oh, yes, I believe in investigation,"
he said then. "And now, Miss Flora," he added briskly, as Miss Flora reached for her wraps, "with your kind permission, I'll walk home with you and have a look at my new job of secretarying." End of Chapter 18. Recording by Linda Lee Paquette. Chapter 19 of Oh, Money, Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Lee Paquette. Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 19. Still Other Flies. It was when his duties of secretaryship to Miss Flora had dwindled to almost infinitesimal proportions that Mr. Smith wished suddenly that he were serving Miss Maggie in that capacity, so concerned was he over a letter that had come to Miss Maggie in that morning's mail. He himself had taken it from the letter-carrier's hand and had placed it on Miss Maggie's little desk. Casually as he did so, he had noticed that it bore a name he recognized as that of a Boston law firm, but he had given it no further thought until later, when, as he sat at his work in the living-room, he had heard Miss Maggie give a low cry, and had looked up to find her staring at the letter in her hand, her face going from red to white and back to red again. "Why, Miss Maggie, what is it?" he cried, springing to his feet. As she turned toward him, he saw that her eyes were full of tears. "Why, it's a letter telling me—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes on his face. Yes, tell me," he begged. "Why, you are crying, dear." Mr. Smith, plainly quite unaware of the caressing word he had used, came nearer, his face aglow with sympathy, his eyes very tender. The red surged once more over Miss Maggie's face. She drew back a little, though manifestly with embarrassment, not displeasure. "It's nothing, really it's nothing," she stammered. "It's just a letter that surprised me." "But it made you cry." "Oh, well, I cry easily sometimes." With hands that shook visibly, she folded the letter and tucked it into its envelope. Then, with a carelessness that was a little too elaborate, she tossed it into her open desk. Very plainly, whatever she had meant to do in the first place, she did not now intend to disclose to Mr. Smith the contents of that letter. "Miss Maggie, please tell me, was it bad news?" "Bad? Why, of course not," she laughed gaily. Mr. Smith thought he detected a break very like a sob in the laugh. "But maybe I could help you," he pleaded. She shook her head. "You couldn't. Indeed you couldn't." "Miss Maggie, was it money matters?" He had his answer in the telltale color that flamed instantly into her face, but her lips said, "It was nothing. It was nothing that need concern you." She hurried away then to the kitchen, and Mr. Smith was left alone to fume up and down the room and frown savagely at the offending envelope tip-tilted against the ink bottle in Miss Maggie's desk, just as Miss Maggie's carefully careless hand had thrown it. Miss Maggie had several more letters from the Boston law firm, and Mr. Smith knew it, though he never heard Miss Maggie cry out at any of the other ones. That they affected her deeply, however, he was certain. Her very evident efforts to lead him to think that they were of no consequence would convince him of their real importance to her, if nothing else had done so. He watched her, therefore, covertly, fearfully, longing to help her, but not daring to offer his services. That the affair had something to do with money matters, he was sure. That she would not deny this naturally strengthened him in this belief. He came in time, therefore, to formulate his own opinion. She had lost money, perhaps a good deal, for her, and she was too proud to let him or anyone else know it. He watched then all the more carefully to see if he could detect any new economies or new deprivations in her daily living. Then, because he could not discover any such, he worried all the more. If she had lost that money, she ought to economize, certainly. Could she be so foolish as to carry her desire for secrecy to so absurd a length as to live just exactly as before, when she really could not afford it? It was at about this time that Mr. Smith requested to have hot water brought to his room morning and night, for which service he insisted, in spite of Miss Maggie's remonstrances, on paying $3 a week extra. There came a strange man to call one day. He was a member of the Boston law firm. Mr. Smith found out that much, but no more. Miss Maggie was almost hysterical after his visit. She talked very fast, and laughed a good deal at supper that night, yet her eyes were full of tears nearly all the time, as Mr. Smith did not fail to perceive. "And I suppose she thinks she's hiding it from me that her heart is breaking," muttered Mr. Smith savagely to himself, as he watched Miss Maggie's nervous efforts to avoid meeting his eyes. "I vow I'll have it out of her. I'll have it out to-morrow." Mr. Smith did not have it out with Miss Maggie the following day, however. Something entirely outside of himself sent his thoughts into a new channel. He was alone in the Duff living-room, and was idling over his work at his table in the corner, when Mrs. Hattie Blaisdell opened the door and hurried in, wringing her hands. Her face was red and swollen from tears. "Where's Maggie? I want Maggie. Isn't Maggie here?" she implored. Mr. Smith sprang to his feet and hastened toward her. "Why, Mrs. Blaisdell, what is it? No, she isn't here. I'm so sorry. Can't I do anything?" "Oh, I don't know. moaned the woman, flinging herself into a chair. "There can't anybody do anything, I suppose. But I've got to have somebody. I can't stay there in that house. I can't. I can't. I can't." "No, no, of course not. And you shan't," soothed the man. "And she'll be here soon, I'm sure, Miss Maggie will. But just let me help you off with your things," he urged, somewhat awkwardly trying to unfasten her heavy wraps. "You'll be so warm here." "Yes, I know." Impatiently, she jerked off the rich fur coat and tossed it into his arms. Then she dropped into the chair again and fell to wringing her hands. "Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" "But what is it?" stammered Mr. Smith helplessly. "Can't I do something? Can't I send for your husband?" At the mention of her husband, Mrs. Blaisdell fell to weeping afresh. No, he's gone to Fred, you know." "To Fred?" Yes, that's what's the matter. Oh, Fred, my boy." "Fred! Oh, Mrs. Blaisdell, I'm so sorry. But what is it?" The woman dropped her hands from her face and looked up wildly, half defiantly. "Mr. Smith, you know Fred. You liked him, didn't you? He isn't bad and wicked, is he? And they can't shut him up if we pay it back, all of it that he took. They won't take my boy to prison." "To prison? Fred!" At the look of horror on Mr. Smith's face, she began to wring her hands again. "You don't know, of course. I'll have to tell you. I'll have to," she moaned. "But, my dear woman, not unless you want to." "I do want to. I've got to talk to somebody. It's this way." With a visible effort, she calmed herself a little and forced herself to talk more coherently. "We got a letter from Fred. It came this morning. He wanted some money, quick. He wanted $700.42. He said he'd got to have it. If he didn't, he'd go and kill himself. He said he'd spent all of his allowance, every cent, and that's what made him take it, this other money, in the first place." "You mean money that didn't belong to him?" Mr. Smith's voice was a little stern. "Yes, but you mustn't blame him. You mustn't blame him, Mr. Smith. He said he owed it. It was a debt of honor. Those were his very words." "Oh, a debt of honor, was it?" Mr. Smith's lips came together grimly. "Yes, and oh, Maggie, what shall I do? What shall I do?" She broke off wildly, leaping to her feet as Miss Maggie pushed open the door and hurried in. "Yes, I know. Don't worry. We'll find something to do." Miss Maggie, white-faced, but with a cheery smile, was throwing off her heavy coat and her hat. A moment later she came over and took Mrs. Hattie's trembling hands in both her own. "Now first, tell me all about it, dear." "You know, then?" "Only a little," answered Miss Maggie, gently pushing the other back into her chair. "I met Frank. Jim telephoned him something just before he left. But I want the whole story. Now, what is it?" "I was just telling Mr. Smith." She began to wring her hands again, but Miss Maggie caught and held them firmly. "You see, Fred, he was treasurer of some club or society or something, and he needed some money to pay a man, and he took that.
the money that belonged to the club, you know, and he thought he could pay it back little by little. But something happened. I don't know what, a new treasurer or something. Anyhow, it was going to be found out that he'd taken it. It was going to be found out tomorrow, and so he wrote the letter to his father. And Jim's gone, and he looked so— oh, I never saw him look so white and terrible. And I'm so afraid of what he'll do to Fred. My boy, my boy."
"Is Jim going to give him the money?" asked Miss Maggie.
"Yes, oh yes. Jim drew it out of the bank. Fred said he must have cash, and he's going to give it to him. Oh, they can't shut him up. They can't send him to prison now, can they?"
"Hush, dear. No, they won't send him to prison. If Jim has gone with the money, Fred will pay it back, and nobody will know it. But, Hattie, Fred did it just the same."
I know it."
"And, Hattie, don't you see? Something will have to be done. Don't you see where all this is leading? Fred has been gambling, hasn't he?"
I'm afraid so."
"And you know he drinks."
Yes, but he isn't going to any more. He said he wasn't. He wrote a beautiful letter. He said if his father would help him out of this scrape, he'd never get into another one, and he'd show how much he appreciated it."
"Good! I'm glad to hear that," cried Miss Maggie. "He'll come out all right yet."
"Of course he will."
Mr. Smith, over at the window, blew his nose vigorously. Mr. Smith had not sat down since Miss Maggie's entrance. He had crossed to the window and had stood looking out at nothing all through Mrs. Hattie's story.
"You do think he will, don't you?"
choked Mrs. Hattie, turning from one to the other piteously.
"He said he was ashamed of himself, that this thing had been an awful lesson to him, and he promised— oh, he promised lots of things, if Jim would only go up and help him out of this. He'd never have to again. But he will. I know he will, if that Gaylord fellow stays there. The whole thing was his fault. I know it was. I hate him. I hate the whole family."
"Why, Hattie, I thought you liked them."
"I don't. They're mean, stuck-up things, and they snub me awfully. Don't you suppose I know when I'm being snubbed? And that Gaylord girl, she's just as bad, and she's making my Bessie just like her. I got Bess into the same school with her, you know, and I was so proud and happy. But I'm not any longer. Why, my Bess, my own daughter, actually looks down on us. She's ashamed of her own father and mother, and she shows it. And it's that Gaylord girl that's done it too, I believe. I thought I was training my daughter to be a lady, a real lady, but I never meant to train her to look down on her own mother."
"I'm afraid Bessie needs something of a lesson," commented Miss Maggie tersely. "But Bessie will be older one of these days, Hattie, and then she'll know more."
"But that's what I've been trying to teach her. More. Something more all the time, Maggie," sighed Mrs. Hattie, wiping her eyes. "And I've tried to remember and call her Elizabeth, too, but I can't. But somehow today nothing seems of any use anyway, and even if she learns more and more, I don't see as it's going to do any good. I haven't got any friends now. I'm not fine enough yet, it seems, for Mrs. Gaylord and all that crowd. They don't want me among them, and they show it. And all my old friends are so envious and jealous since the money came that they don't want me, and they show it. So I don't feel comfortable anywhere."
"Never mind, dear. Just stop trying to live as you think other folks want you to live, and live as you want to for a while." Mrs. Hattie smiled faintly, wiped her eyes again, and got to her feet.
"You talk just like Jim. He's always saying that."
"Well, just try it," smiled Miss Maggie, helping her visitor into the luxurious fur coat. "You've no idea how much more comfort you'll take."
"Would I?"
Mrs. Hattie's eyes were wistful, but almost instantly they showed an alert gleam of anger.
"Well, anyhow, I'm not going to try to do what those Gaylords do any longer. And you're sure Fred won't have to go to prison?"
"I'm very sure," nodded Miss Maggie.
"All right, then. I can go home now with some comfort. You always make me feel better, Maggie. And you too, Mr. Smith. I'm much obliged to you. Good-bye."
"Good-bye," said Mr. Smith. "Good-bye," said Miss Maggie. "Now go home and go to bed, and don't worry any more, or you'll have one of your headaches." As the door closed behind her visitor, Miss Maggie turned and sank into a chair. She looked worn and white and utterly weary. "I hope she won't meet Frank or Jane anywhere," she sighed profoundly.
"Why? What do you mean? Do you think they'd blame her about this unfortunate affair of Fred's?"
Miss Maggie sighed again. "I wasn't thinking of that. I was thinking of another matter. I just came from Frank's, and—"
"Yes?"
Something in her face sent a questioning frown to Mr. Smith's own countenance. "Do you remember hearing Flora say that Jane had bought a lot of the Benson gold mine stock?"
"Yes."
"Well, Benson has failed, and they've just found out that that gold mine stock is worth about 2 cents on a dollar."
2 cents? And how much?
"About $40,000, said Miss Maggie wearily. Mr. Smith sat down.
"Well, I'll be—"
He did not finish his sentence. End of Chapter 19. Recording by Linda Lee Paquette.
Chapter 20 of Oh, Money, Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Neil Donnelly. Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 20. Frankenstein. Being a letter from John Smith to Edward D. Norton, attorney at law. My dear Ned, wasn't there a story written once about a fellow who created some sort of a machine man without any soul that raised the very dickens and all for him? Frankenstein. I guess that was it. Well, I've created a Frankenstein creature, and I'm dead up against it to know what to do with him. Ned, what in heaven's name am I going to do with Mr. John Smith? Mr. John Smith, let me tell you, is a very healthy, persistent, insistent, important person, with many kind friends, a definite position in the world, and no small degree of influence. Worse yet, now prepare for a stunning blow, Ned, Mr. Smith has been so inconsiderate as to fall in love. Yes, he has. And he has fallen in love as absolutely and as idiotically as if he were 21 instead of 52. Now, will you kindly tell me how Mr. John Smith is going to fade away into nothingness? And even if he finds a way to do that, shall he, before fading, pop the question for Mr. Stanley G. Fulton, or shall he trust to Mr. Stanley G. Fulton's being able to win for himself the love Mr. John Smith fondly hopes is his? Seriously, joking aside, I'm afraid I've made a mess of things, not only for myself, but for everybody else. First, my own future. I'll spare you rhapsodies, Ned. They say, anyway, that there's no fool like an old fool. But I will admit that that future looks very dark to me if I am not to have the companionship of the little woman, Maggie Duff. Oh yes, it's poor Maggie. You've probably guessed as much. As for Maggie herself, perhaps it's conceited, but I believe she's not entirely indifferent to Mr. John Smith. How she'll like Mr. Stanley G. Fulton, I have my doubts. But alas! I have no doubts whatever as to what her opinion will be of Mr. Stanley G. Fulton's masquerading as Mr. John Smith, and I don't envy Mr. Stanley G. Fulton the job he's got in his hands to put himself right with her either. But there's one thing he can be sure of, at least. If she does care for Mr. John Smith, it wasn't Mr. Stanley G. Fulton's money that was the bait. Poor Maggie. There, you see, already I've adopted the Hillerton vernacular. But I fear Miss Maggie is indeed poor now. She has had several letters that I don't like the looks of, and a call from a villainous-looking man from Boston, one of your craft, I believe, begging your pardon. I think she's lost some money, and I don't believe she had any extra to lose. She's as proud as Lucifer, however, and she's determined no one shall find out she's lost any money, so her laugh is gayer than ever. But I know just the same. I can hear something in her voice that isn't laughter. Jove! Ned, what a mess I have made of it. I feel more than ever now like the boy with his ear to the keyhole. These people are my friends, or rather, they are Mr. John Smith's friends. As for being mine, who am I, Smith or Fulton? Will they be Fulton's friends after they find he is John Smith? Will they be Smith's friends even after they find he is Fulton? Pleasant position I am in, what? Ah, yes, I can hear you say that it serves me right, and that you warned me, and that I was deaf to all remonstrances. It does, you did, I was. Now we'll waste no more time on that. I've admitted all you could say. I've acknowledged my error, and my transgression is ever before me. I built the box, I walked into it, and I deliberately shut the cover down. But now I want to get out. I've got to get out some way. I can't spend the rest of my natural existence as John Smith hunting Blaisdell data, though sometimes I think I'd be willing to if it's the only way to stay with Miss Maggie. I tell you that little woman can make a home out of... But I couldn't stay with Miss Maggie. John Smith wouldn't have money enough to pay his board, to say nothing of inviting Miss Maggie to board with him, would he? The opening of Mr. Stanley G. Fulton's last will and testament on the first day of next November will effectually cut off Mr. John Smith's source of income. There is no provision in the will for Mr. John Smith. Smith would have to go to work. I don't think he'd like that. By the way, I wonder, do you suppose John Smith could earn his salt if he was hard put to it? Very plainly, then, something has got to be done about getting John Smith to fade away and Stanley G. Fulton to appear before next November. And I'd thought it would be so easy. Early this summer, John Smith was to pack up his Blaisdell data, bid a pleasant adieu to Hillerton, and betake himself to South America. In due course, after a short trip to some obscure Inca city or down some little-known river, Mr. Stanley G. Fulton would arrive at some South American hotel from the interior, and would take immediate passage for the States, reaching Chicago long before November 1st. There would be a slight flurry, of course, and a few annoying interviews and write-ups, but Mr. Stanley G. Fulton always was known to keep his affairs to himself pretty well, and the matter would soon be put down as merely another of the multimillionaire's eccentricities. The whole thing would then be all over, and well over. But nowhere had there been taken into consideration the possibilities of a Maggie Duff. And now, to me, that same Maggie Duff is the only thing worth considering, anywhere. So there you are. And even after all this, I haven't accomplished what I set out to do. That is, find the future possessor of the Fulton millions. Unless Miss Maggie, bless her, says yes, and even then someone will have to have them after us. I have found out one thing, though. As conditions are now, I should not want either Frank or James or Flora to have them. Not unless the millions could bring them more happiness than these 100,000 apiece have brought. Honest, Ned, that miserable money has made more... But never mind. It's too long a story to write. I'll tell you when I see you, if I ever do see you. There's still the possibility, that Mr. Stanley G. Fulton is lost in the dark of South America, and, of course, John Smith can go to work. I believe I won't sign any name. I haven't got any name that I feel really belongs to me now. Still, I might. Yes, I will sign it. Frankenstein. End of chapter 20. Recorded by Neil Donnelly.
Chapter 21 of Oh, Money, Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary Day. Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 21. Sympathies Misplaced. The first time Mr. Smith saw Frank Blaisdell, after Miss Maggie's news of the $40,000 loss, he tried somewhat awkwardly to express his interest and sympathy, but Frank Blaisdell cut him short. "That's all right, and I thank you," he cried heartily. "And I know most folks would think losing $40,000 was about as bad as it could be. Jane, now, is all worked up over it, can't sleep nights, and has gone back to turning down the gas, eating sour cream, so's to save and help make it up. But me, I call it the best thing that ever happened." "Well, really," laughed Mr. Smith, "I'm sure that's a very delightful way to look at it, if you can." "Well, I can, and I'll tell you why. It's put me back where I belong, behind the counter of a grocery store. I bought out the old stand. Oh, I've had enough left for that, and more. I closed the deal last night. Gorry, but I was glad to feel the old floor under my feet again." "But I thought you were tired of work, and wanted to enjoy yourself," stammered Mr. Smith. Frank Blaisdell laughed. "Tired of work? Wanting to enjoy myself, indeed. Yes, I know I did say something like that. But let me tell you this, Mr. Smith. Talk about work. I never worked so hard in my life as I have these last 10 months, trying to enjoy myself. How these folks can stand gadding round the country week in and week out, feeding their stomachs on a French dictionary instead of good United States meat and potatoes and squash, and spending their days traipsing off to see things they ain't a mite interested in, and their nights trying to get rested so they can go and see some more the next day, I don't understand." Mr. Smith chuckled. "I'm afraid these touring agencies wouldn't like to have you write their ads for them, Mr. Blaisdell." "Well, they hadn't better ask me to," smiled the other grimly. "But that ain't all. Since I came back, I've been working even harder, trying to enjoy myself here at home, knocking silly little balls over a 10-acre lot in a game a healthy 10-year-old boy would scorn to play." "But how about your new car? Didn't you enjoy riding in that?" bantered Mr. Smith. "Oh, yes, I enjoyed the riding well enough. But I didn't enjoy hunting for punctures, putting on new tyres, or burrowing into the inside of the critter to find out why she didn't go. And that's what I was doing most of the time. I never did like machinery. It ain't in my line." He paused a moment, then went on a little wistfully. "I suspect, Mr. Smith, there ain't anything in my line but groceries. It's all I know. It's all I've ever known. If I had my life to live over again, I'd do different, maybe. I'd see if I couldn't find out what there was in a picture, to make folks stand and stare at it an hour at a time, when you could see the whole thing in a minute. And it wasn't worth looking at, anyway, even for a minute. And music, too. Now, I like a good tune what is a tune, but them caterwaulings and dirges that chap Gray plays on that fiddle of his, gorry, Mr. Smith, I'd rather hear the old barn door at home squeak any day. But if I was younger, I'd try to learn to like them. I would. Look at Flora now. She can set by the hour in front of that phonograph of hers and not know it. Yes, I know, smiled Mr. Smith. And there's books, too, resumed the other, still wistfully. I'd read books, if I could stay awake long enough to do it, and I'd find out what there was in them to make a good, sensible man like Jim Blaisdell daft over them. And Maggie Duff, too. Why, that little woman used to go hungry sometimes when she was a girl, so she could buy a book she wanted. I know she did. Why, I'd have given anything this last year if I could have got interested, really interested, reading. I could have killed an awful lot of time that way, but I couldn't do it. I bought a lot of them too, and tried it, but I expect I didn't begin young enough. I tell you, Mr. Smith, I've about come to the conclusion that there ain't a thing in the world so hard to kill as time. I've tried it, and I know. Why, I got so I couldn't even kill it eating, though I most killed myself trying to. And let me tell you another thing. A full stomach ain't in it with being hungry and knowing a good dinner's coming. Why, there's whole weeks at a time back there that I didn't know the meaning of the word hungry. You ought to seen the jolt I give one of them waiter chaps one day when he comes up with his paper and his pencil and asked me what I wanted. Want, says I. There ain't but one thing on this earth I want, and you can't give it to me. I want to want something. I'm tired of being so blamed satisfied all the time. And what did Alfonso say to that? Chuckled Mr. Smith appreciatively. Alfonso? Oh, the waiter fellow, you mean? He just stared at me a minute, then mumbled his usual, "Yes, sir, very good, sir," and shoved that confounded printed card of his a little nearer to my nose. But there, I guess you've heard enough of this, Mr. Smith. It's only that I was trying to tell you why I'm actually glad we lost that money. It's given me back my man's job again. Good. All right, then. I won't waste any more sympathy on you, laughed Mr. Smith. Well, you needn't. And there's another thing. I hope it'll give me back a little of my old faith in my fellow man. What do you mean by that? Just this. I won't suspect every man, woman and child that says a civil word to me now of having designs on my pocket-book. Why, Mr. Smith, you wouldn't believe it if I told you the things that's been done and said to get a little money out of me. Of course, the open gold brick schemes I knew enough to dodge. Most of them, unless you count in that darn Benson mining stock. And I spotted the blackmailers all right, most generally. But I was flabbergasted when a woman tackled the job and began to make love to me. Actually make love to me. One day, when Jane's back was turned. Gorry, do I look such a fool as that, Mr. Smith? Well, anyhow, there won't be any more of that kind. Nor anybody after my money now, I guess, he finished with a sage wag of his head as he turned away. To Miss Maggie that evening, Mr. Smith said, after recounting the earlier portion of the conversation, "So you see you were right, after all. I shall have to own up to it. Mr. Frank Blaisdell had plenty to retire upon, but nothing to retire to. But I'm glad if he's happy now. And he isn't the only one that $40,000 loss has done a good turn to," nodded Miss Maggie. "Millicent has just been here. You know she's home from school. It's the Easter vacation anyway. But she isn't going back. It's too expensive." Miss Maggie spoke with studied casualness, but there was an added colour in her cheeks. Miss Maggie always flushed a little when she mentioned Millicent's name to Mr. Smith, in spite of her indignant efforts not to do so. "Oh, is that true?" "Yes, well, the Pennocks had a dance last night, and Millicent went. She said she had to laugh to see Mrs. Pennock's efforts to keep Carl away from her. The loss of the money is known everywhere now, and has been greatly exaggerated, I've heard. She said that even Hibbard Gaylord had the air of one trying to let her down easily. Millicent was immensely amused. Where was Donald Gray? Oh, he wasn't there. He doesn't move in the Pennock crowd much. But Millicent sees him, and everything's all right there now. That's why Millicent is so happy. You mean, has her mother given in? Yes, you see, Jane was at the dance too, and she saw Carl, and she saw Hibbard Gaylord, and she was furious. She told Millicent this morning that she had her opinion of fellows who would show so plainly, as Hibbard Gaylord did, that it was the money they were after. I'm afraid Mrs. Jane has changed her shoes again, murmured Mr. Smith, his eyes merry. Has changed? Oh! Miss Maggie's puzzled frown gave way to a laugh. Well, yes, perhaps the shoe is on the other foot again. But anyway, she doesn't love Carl or Hibbard any more, and she does love Donald Gray. He hasn't let the loss of the money make any difference to him, you see. He's been even more devoted, if anything. She told Millicent this morning that he was a very estimable young man, and she liked him very much. Perhaps you see now why Millicent is happy. Good. I'm glad to know it, cried Mr. Smith heartily. I'm glad. His face changed suddenly. His eyes grew sombre. I'm glad the loss of the money brought them some happiness, if the possession of it didn't, he finished moodily, turning to go back to his own room. At the hall door he paused and looked back at Miss Maggie, standing by the table, gazing after him with troubled eyes. Did Millicent say whether Fred was there? He asked. Yes, she said he wasn't there. He didn't come home for this vacation at all. She said he didn't know why. I suspect Millicent doesn't know anything about that wretched affair of his. Well, hope not. So the young gentleman didn't show up at all? No, nor Bessie. She went home with a Long Island girl. Hattie didn't go to the Pennocks either. Hattie has been very different since this affair of Fred's. I think it frightened her terribly. And it was so near a tragedy. The boy threatened to kill himself, you know, if his father didn't help him out. But his father did help him out, flared the man irritably. Yes, I know he did, and I'm afraid he found things in a pretty bad mess when he got there, sighed Miss Maggie. It was a bad mess all around. You are exactly right, ejaculated Mr. Smith, with sudden and peculiar emphasis. It is, indeed, a bad mess all around, he growled, as he disappeared through the door. Behind him, Miss Maggie stood still and motionless, looking after him with troubled eyes. As the spring days grew warmer, Miss Maggie had occasion many times to look after Mr. Smith with troubled eyes. She could not understand him at all. One day he would be the old delightful companion, genial, cheery, generously donating a box of chocolates to the centre-table bonbon dish, or a dozen hothouse roses to the mantel vase. The next he would be nervous, abstracted, almost irritable, yet she could see no possible reason for the change. Sometimes she wondered fearfully if Millicent could have anything to do with it. Was it possible that he had cared for Millicent, and to see her now so happy with Donald Gray was more than he could bear? It did not seem credible. There was his own statement that he had devoted himself to her solely, and only to help keep the undesirable lovers away, and give Donald Gray a chance. Besides, had he not said that he was not a marrying man anyway? To be sure, that seemed a pity. A man so kind and thoughtful, and so delightfully companionable. But then, it was nothing to her, of course. Only she did hope he was not feeling unhappy over Millicent. Miss Maggie wished, too, that Mr. Smith would not bring flowers and candy so often. It worried her. She felt as if he was spending too much money, and she had got the impression in some way that he did not have any too much money to spend. And there were the expensive motor trips too. She feared Mr. Smith was extravagant, yet she could not tell him so, of course. He never seemed to realise the value of $1 anyway, and he very obviously did not know how to get the most out of it. Look at his foolish generosity in regard to the board he paid her. Miss Maggie wondered sometimes if it might not be worry over money matters that was making him so nervous and irritable on occasions now. Plainly, he was very near the end of his work here at Hillerton. He was not getting so many letters on Blaisdell matters from far away, either. For a month now he had done nothing but a useless repetition of old work, and of late, a good deal of the time he was not even making that pretence of being busy. For days at a time he would not touch his records. That could mean but one thing, of course. His work was done, yet he seemed to be making no move towards departure. Not that she wanted him to go. She should miss him very much when he went, of course, but she did not like to feel that he was staying simply because he had nowhere to go and nothing to do. Miss Maggie did not believe in able-bodied men who had nowhere to go and nothing to do, and she wanted very much to believe in Mr. Smith. She had been under the impression that he was getting the Blaisdell material together for a book, and that he was intending to publish it himself. He had been very happy and interested. Now he was unhappy and uninterested. His book must be ready, but he was making no move to publish it. To Miss Maggie this could mean but one thing. Some financial reverses had made it impossible for him to carry out his plans, and had left him stranded with no definite aims for the future. She was so sorry, but there seemed to be nothing that she could do. She had tried to help by insisting that he pay less for his board, but he had not only scouted that idea, but had bought her more chocolates and flowers than ever, for all the world as if he had divined her suspicions and wished to disprove them. That Mr. Smith was trying to keep something from her, Miss Maggie was sure. She was the more sure, perhaps, because she herself had something that she was trying to keep hidden from Mr. Smith, and she thought she recognised the symptoms. Meanwhile, April budded into May, and May blossomed into June, and June brought all the Blaisdells together again in Hillerton. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Oh, Money, Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary Day. Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 22. With every Jim, a James. 2 days after Frank Blaisdell had returned from college, his mother came to see Miss Maggie. Mr. Smith was rearranging the books on Miss Maggie's shelves and trying to make room for the new ones he had bought her through the winter. When Miss Hattie came in, red-eyed and flushed-faced, he ceased his work at once and would have left the room, but she stopped him with a gesture. "No, don't go. You know all about it anyway, and I'd just as soon you knew the rest, so you can keep right to work. I just came down to talk things over with Maggie. I'm sure I don't know what I'm going to do when I can't." "But you always can, dear," soothed Miss Maggie cheerily, handing her visitor a fan and taking a chair near her. Mr. Smith, after a moment's hesitation, turned quietly back to his bookshelves. "But I can't," choked Miss Hattie. I'm going away." "Away? Where? What do you mean?" cried Miss Maggie. "Not to live?" "Yes, that's what I came to tell you." "Why, Hattie Blaisdell, where are you going?" "To Plainville. Next month." "Plainville? Oh, well, cheer up. That's only 40 miles from here. I guess we can still see each other. Now, tell me, what does this all mean?" "Well, of course it began with Fred. His trouble, you know. But I thought Jim fixed that all up, dear." "Oh, he did. He paid the money, and nobody there at college knew a thing about it. But there were other things. Fred told us some of them night before last. He says he's ashamed of himself, but that he believes there's enough left in him to make a man of him yet. But he says he can't do it there." "You mean he doesn't want to go back to college?" Miss Maggie's voice showed her disappointment. "Oh, he wants to go to college, but not there." "Oh," nodded Miss Maggie. "I see. He says he's had too much money to spend, and that it wouldn't be easy not to spend it if he was back there in the old crowd. So he wants to go somewhere else." "Well, that's all right, isn't it?" "Yes. Oh, yes. Jim says it is. He's awfully happy over it, and I guess I am." "Of course you are. But now, what's this about Plainville?" "Oh, that grew out of it, all this. Mr. Hammond is going to open a new office in Plainville, and he offered Jim, I'm not going to call him James any more, the chance to manage it." "Well, that's fine, I'm sure." "Yes, of course, that part is fine. Splendid. He'll get a bigger salary and all that, and I guess I'm glad to go anyway. I don't like Hillerton any more. I haven't got any friends here, Maggie. Of course, I wouldn't have had anything to do with the Gaylords now, after what's happened. That boy getting my boy to drink and gamble and everything. Yet, you know how I've strained every nerve for years, and worked to get where my children could be with them. It didn't pay, did it, Hattie?" "I guess it didn't. They're perfectly horrid, every one of them, and I hate them." "Oh, Hattie, Hattie." "Well, I do. Look at what they've done to Fred, and Bessie too. I shan't let her be with them any more, either. There aren't any folks here we can be with just now. That's why I don't mind going away. All our friends that we used to know don't like us any more. They're so jealous on account of the money. Oh, yes, I know you think I'm to blame for that," she went on aggrievedly. "I can see you do by your face. Jim says so too, and maybe I am. But it was just so I could get ahead. I did so want to be somebody." "I know, Hattie." Miss Maggie looked as if she would like to say something more, but she didn't say it. Over at the bookcase, Mr. Smith was abstractedly opening and shutting the book in his hand. His gaze was out the window near him. He had not touched the books on the shelves for some time. "And look at how I've tried, and see what it's come to. Bessie so high-headed and airy that she makes fun of us, and Fred a gambler and a drunkard and almost a thief. And it's all that horrid $100,000. The book in Mr. Smith's hand slipped to the floor with a bang, but no one was noticing Mr. Smith. "Oh, Hattie, don't blame the $100,000, cried Miss Maggie. "Jim says it was, and Fred does too. They've talked awfully. Fred said it was all just the same kind of way that I'd tried to make folks call Jim James. He said I'd been trying to make every single Jim we had into a James, until I'd taken away all the fun of living. And I suppose maybe he's right too." Miss Hattie sighed profoundly. "Well, anyway, I'm not going to do it any more. There isn't any fun in it anyway. It doesn't make any difference how hard I tried to get ahead. I always found someone else a little aheader, as Benny calls it. So what's the use?" "There isn't any use in that kind of trying, Hattie." "No, I suppose there isn't. Jim said I was like the little boy that they asked what would make him the happiest of anything in the world. And he answered, 'Everything that I haven't got.' And I suppose I have been something like that. But I don't see it as I'm any worse than other folks. Everybody goes for money, but I'm sure I don't see why, if it doesn't make them any happier than it has me. Well, I must be going." Mrs. Hattie rose wearily. "We shall begin to pack the 1st of the month. It looks like a mountain to me, but Jim and Fred say they'll help, and—" Mr. Smith did not hear any more, for Miss Maggie and her guest had reached the hall and closed the door behind them. But when Miss Maggie returned, Mr. Smith was pacing up and down the room nervously. "Well?" he demanded with visible irritation as soon as she appeared. "Will you kindly tell me if there is anything desirable that confounded money has done?" Miss Maggie looked up in surprise. "You mean Jim Blaisdell's money?" she asked. "I mean all the money. I mean the $300,000 that those three people received. Has it ever brought any good or happiness anywhere?" "Oh, yes, I know," smiled Miss Maggie a little sadly. "But—" Her countenance changed abruptly. A passionate earnestness came to her eyes. "Don't blame the money. Blame the spending of it. The money isn't to blame. The dollar that will buy tickets to the movies will just as quickly buy a good book. And if you're hungry, it's up to you whether you put your money into chocolate eclairs or roast beef. Is the money to blame that goes for a whiskey bill or a gambling debt, instead of for shoes and stockings for the family?" "Why, no." Mr. Smith had apparently lost his own irritation in his amazement at hers. "Why, Miss Maggie, you seem worked up over this matter." "I am worked up. I'm always worked up over money. It's been money, money, money ever since I could remember. We're all after it, and we all want it, and we strain every nerve to get it. We think it's going to bring us happiness, but it won't unless we do our part. And there are some things that even money can't buy. Besides, it isn't the money that does the things anyway. It's the man behind the money. What do you think money is good for, Mr. Smith?" Mr. Smith, now thoroughly dazed, actually blinked his eyes at the question and at the vehemence with which it was hurled into his face. "Why, Miss Maggie, it isn't good for anything unless we can exchange it for something we want, is it? Why, I suppose we can give it, but even then we're exchanging it for something we want, aren't we? We want to make the other fellow happy, don't we?" "Well, yes, we do." Mr. Smith spoke with sudden fervour. "But it doesn't always work that way. Look at the case right here. Now, very likely this Mr. Fulton thought those $300,000 was going to make these people happy. Personification of happiness that woman was a few minutes ago, wasn't she?" Mr. Smith had regained his air of aggrieved irritation. "No, she wasn't. But that wasn't the money's fault. It was her own. She didn't know how to spend it. And that's just what I mean when I say we've got to do our part. Money won't buy happiness unless we can exchange it for the things that will bring happiness. If we don't know how to get happiness out of $5, we won't know how to get it out of 500 or 5,000 or 500,000. I don't mean that we'll get the same amount out of $5, of course, though I've even seen that happen sometimes. But I mean we've got to know how to spend $5 and make the most of it." "I reckon you're right, Miss Maggie. I know I'm right. And 'tisn't the money's fault when things go wrong. Money's all right. I love money. Oh, yes, I know we're taught that the love of money is the root of all evil, but I don't think it should be so necessarily. I think money is one of the most wonderful things in the world. It's more than a trust and a gift. It's an opportunity and a test. It brings out what's strongest in us every time, and it does that whether it's $5 or $500,000. If we love chocolate eclairs and the movies better than roast beef and good books, we're going to buy them, whether they're chocolate eclairs and movies on $5 or champagne suppers and Paris gowns on $500,000. Well, by Jove!" ejaculated Mr. Smith rather feebly. Miss Maggie gave a shamefaced laugh and sank back in her chair. "You don't know what to make of me, do you? Of course, and no wonder," she sighed. "But I've felt so bad over this money business right here under my eyes. I love them all, every one of them. And you know how it's been, Mr. Smith. Hasn't it worked out to prove just what I say? Take Hattie this afternoon. She said Fred declared she'd been trying to make every one of her Jims a James ever since the money came. But he forgot that she did that very same thing before it came. All her life she's been trying to make $5 look like 10. So when she got the 100,000, it wasn't 6 months before she was trying to make it look like 200,000. I reckon you're right. Jane is just the opposite. Jane used to buy ingrain carpets and cheap chairs and cover them with mats and tidies to save them. You're right, she did. Miss Maggie laughed appreciatively. They got on your nerves too, didn't they? Such layers upon layers of covers for everything. It brought me to such a pass that I went to the other extreme. I wouldn't protect anything, which was very reprehensible, of course. Well, now she has pretty dishes and solid silver, but she hides them in bags and boxes, and never uses them except for company. She doesn't take any comfort any more with them than she did with the ingrain carpets and cheap chairs. Of course, that's a little thing. I only mention it to illustrate my meaning. Jane doesn't know how to play. She never did. When you can't spend 5 cents out of $100 for pleasure without wincing, you needn't expect you're going to spend $5 out of 100,000 without feeling the pinch, laughed Miss Maggie. And Miss Flora, you haven't mentioned her, observed Mr. Smith a little grimly. Miss Maggie smiled, and then she sighed. Poor Flora! And when she tried so hard to quiet her conscience because she had so much money. But you know how that was. You helped her out of that scrape, and she's so grateful. She told me yesterday that she hardly ever gets a begging letter now. No, and those she does, she investigates, asserted Mr. Smith, so the fakes don't bother her much these days. And she's doing a lot of good, too, in a small way. She is, and she's happy now, declared Miss Maggie, except that she still worries a little because she is so happy. She dismissed the maid and does her own work. I'm afraid Miss Flora was never cut out for a fine lady life of leisure. And she loves to putter in the kitchen. She says it's such a relief, too, not to keep dressed up company manners all the time, not to have that horrid girl spying round all day to see if she behaves proper. But Flora's a dear. She is, and I reckoned it worked the best with her of any of them. Worked? Hesitated Miss Maggie. Yes, that is, I mean, perhaps she's made the best use of the 100,000, stammered Mr. Smith. She's been, the happiest. Why, yes, perhaps she has, when you come to look at it that way. But you wouldn't advise this Mr. Fulton to leave her his 20 millions? Mercy! Laughed Miss Maggie, throwing up both hands. She'd faint dead away at the mere thought of it. Yes, I suppose so. Mr. Smith turned on his heel and resumed his restless pacing up and down the room. From time to time he glanced furtively at Miss Maggie. Miss Maggie, her hands idly resting in her lap, palms upward, was gazing fixedly at nothing. Of just what are you thinking? He demanded at last, coming to a pause at her side. I was thinking of Mr. Stanley G. Fulton, she answered, not looking up. Oh, you were? There was an odd something in Mr. Smith's voice. Yes, I was wondering about those 20 millions. Oh, you were? The odd something had increased, but Miss Maggie's eyes were still dreamily fixed on space. Yes, I was wondering what he'd done with them. Had done with them? Yes, in the letter, I mean. She looked up now in faint surprise. Don't you remember? There was a letter, a second letter, to be opened in 2 years' time. They said that was to dispose of the remainder of the property, his last will and testament. Oh, yes, I remember, assented Mr. Smith, turning on his heel again. Then you think Mr. Fulton is dead? Mr. Smith was very carefully not meeting Miss Maggie's eyes. Why, yes, I suppose so. Miss Maggie turned back to her meditative gazing at nothing. The 2 years are nearly up, you know. I was talking with Jane the other day. Just next November. Yes, I know. The words were very near a groan. But at once Mr. Smith hurriedly repeated, I know, very lightly indeed, with an apprehensive glance at Miss Maggie. So it seems to me that if he were alive, that he'd have been back by this time. So I was wondering about those millions, she went on musingly. What do you suppose he has done with them? She asked with sudden animation, turning full upon him. Why, how should I know? Stuttered Mr. Smith, a swift crimson dyeing his face. Miss Maggie laughed merrily. You wouldn't, of course. but that needn't make you look as if I'd intimated that you had them. I was only asking for your opinion, Mr. Smith." She twinkled with mischievous eyes. "Of course," laughed Mr. Smith, a little precipitately. "But indeed, Miss Maggie, you turned so suddenly, and the question was so unexpected, that I felt like the small boy who, always being blamed for everything at home that went wrong, answered tremblingly when the teacher demanded, 'Who made the world?' 'Please, ma'am, I did, but I'll never do it again.'" "And now," said Mr. Smith, when Miss Maggie had done laughing at his little story, "suppose I turn the tables on you. What do you think Mr. Fulton has done with that money?" "I don't know what to think." Miss Maggie shifted her position, her face growing intently interested again. "I've been trying to remember what I know of the man." "What you know of him?" cried Mr. Smith with startled eyes. "Yes, from the newspaper and magazine accounts of him. Of course, there was quite a lot about him at the time the money came, and Flora let me read some things she'd saved in years gone. Flora was always interested in him, you know." "Well, what did you find?" "Why, not much really about the man. Besides, very likely what I did find wasn't true. Oh, he was eccentric. Everything mentioned that. But I was trying to find out how he spent his money himself. I thought that might give me a clue. About the will, I mean." "Oh, I see." "Yes, but I didn't find much. In spite of his reported eccentricities, he seems to me to have done nothing very extraordinary." "Oh, indeed," murmured Mr. Smith. "He doesn't seem to have been very bad." "No?" Mr. Smith's eyebrows went up. "Nor very good either, for that matter. Sort of a nonentity, perhaps." Mr. Smith's lips snapped tight shut. Miss Maggie laughed softly. "Perhaps. Though I suppose he couldn't really be that. Not very well, with 20 millions, could he? But I mean, he wasn't very bad nor very good. He didn't seem to be dissipated or mixed up in any scandal, or to be recklessly extravagant like so many rich men. On the other hand, I couldn't find that he'd done any particular good in the world. Some charities were mentioned, but they were perfunctory, apparently, and I don't believe, from the accounts, that he was ever really interested himself in any one, that he ever really cared for any one." "Oh, you don't?" If Miss Maggie had looked up, she would have met a most disconcerting expression in the eyes bent upon her. But Miss Maggie did not look up. "No," she proceeded calmly. "Why, he didn't even have a wife and children to stir him from his selfishness. He had a secretary, of course, and he probably never saw half his begging letters. I can imagine him tossing them aside with a languid, 'Fix them up, James. Give the creatures what they want, only don't bother me.'" "He never did," stormed Mr. Smith. Then hastily, "I'm sure he never did. You wrong him. I'm sure you wrong him." "Maybe I do," sighed Miss Maggie. "But when I think of what he might do, 20 millions, I can't grasp it. Can you? But he didn't do anything worth while with them, so far as I can see, when he was living. So that's why I can't imagine what his will may be. Probably the same old perfunctory charities, however, with the Chicago law firm instead of James as disburser. Unless, of course, Hattie's expectations are fulfilled, and he divides them among the Blaisdells here." "You think there's something worth while he might have done with those millions, then?" pleaded Mr. Smith, a peculiar wistfulness in his eyes. "Something he might have done with them!" exclaimed Miss Maggie. "Why, it seems to me there's no end of what he might have done with 20 millions. What would you do?" "I do with 20 millions?" she breathed. "Yes, you." Mr. Smith came nearer, his face working with emotion. "Miss Maggie, if a man with 20 millions—that is, could you love a man with 20 millions? If Mr. Fulton should ask you, if I were Mr. Fulton, if I—" His countenance changed suddenly. He drew himself up with a cry of dismay. "Oh, no, no! I've spoiled it all now. That isn't what I meant to say first. I was going to find out—I was going to tell— Oh, good heavens! That confounded money! Again!" Miss Maggie sprang to her feet. Why, Mr. Smith, what—" Only the crisp shutting of the door answered her. With a beseeching look and despairing gesture, Mr. Smith had gone. Once again Miss Maggie stood looking after Mr. Smith with dismayed eyes. Then, turning to sit down, she came face to face with her own image in the mirror. "Well, now you've done it, Maggie Duff," she whispered wrathfully to the reflection in the glass. "And you've broken his heart. He was going to say something. I know he was. And you've talked money, money, money to him for an hour. You said you loved money, and you told what you'd do if you had $20 million. And you know he's as poor as Job's turkey, and that just now he's even more plagued than ever over money. And yet $20 million, as if that counted against—" With a little sobbing cry, Miss Maggie covered her face with her hands and sat down, helplessly, angrily. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of Oh, Money, Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter. Reflections, mirrored and otherwise. Miss Maggie was still sitting in the big chair with her face in her hands when the door opened and Mr. Smith came in. He was very white. Miss Maggie, dropping her hands and starting up at his entrance, caught a glimpse of his face in the mirror in front of her. With a furtive, angry dab of her fingers at her wet eyes, she fell to rearranging the vases and photographs on the mantel. "Oh, back again, Mr. Smith?" she greeted him with studied unconcern. Mr. Smith shut the door and advanced determinedly. "Miss Maggie, I've got to face this thing out, of course. Even if I had made a botch of things at the very start, it didn't help any to run away, as I did. And I was a coward to do it. It was only because but never mind that. I'm coming now straight to the point. Miss Maggie, will you marry me?" The photograph in Miss Maggie's hand fell face down on the shelf. Miss Maggie's fingers caught the edge of the mantel in a convulsive grip. A swift glance in the mirror before her disclosed Mr. Smith's face just over her shoulder, earnest, pleading, and still very white. She dropped her gaze and turned half away. She did not want to meet Mr. Smith's eyes just then. She tried to speak, but only a half-choking little breath came. Then Mr. Smith spoke again. "Miss Maggie, please don't say no yet. Let me explain how I came here and all that. But first, before I do that, let me tell you how I love you, how I have loved you all these long months. I think I loved you from the first time I saw you. Whatever comes, I want you to know that. And if you could care for me a little, just a little, I'm sure I could make it more in time so you would marry me. And we would be so happy. Don't you believe I'd try to make you happy, dear?" "Yes, oh yes," murmured Miss Maggie, still with her head turned away. "Good. Then all you've got to say is that you'll let me try. And we will be happy, dear. Why, until I came here, to this little house, I didn't know what living, real living was. And I have been, just as you said, a selfish old thing." Miss Maggie, with a start of surprise, faced the image in the mirror, but Mr. Smith was looking at her, not at her reflection, so she did not meet his eyes. "Why, I never—" she stammered. "Yes, you did, a minute ago. Don't you remember? Oh, of course you didn't realize everything, and perhaps you wouldn't have said it if you'd known. But you said it, and you meant it, and I'm glad you said it. And, dear little woman, don't you see, that's only another reason why you should say yes. You can show me how not to be selfish." "But, Mr. Smith, I stammered Miss Maggie, still with puzzled eyes. "Yes, you can. You can show me how to make life really worth while for me and for lots of others. And now I have someone to care for, And oh, little woman, I care so much. It can't be that you don't care any." Miss Maggie caught her breath and turned away again. "Don't you care a little?" The red crept up Miss Maggie's neck to her forehead, but still she was silent. "If I could only see your eyes," pleaded the man. Then suddenly he saw Miss Maggie's face in the mirror. The next moment Miss Maggie herself turned a little, and in the mirror their eyes met, and in the mirror Mr. Smith found his answer. "You do care a little," he breathed as he took her in his arms. "But I don't." Miss Maggie shook her head vigorously against his coat collar. "What?" Mr. Smith's clasp loosened a little. "I care a great deal," whispered Miss Maggie to the coat collar with shameless emphasis. "You darling!" triumphed the man, bestowing a rapturous kiss on the tip of a small pink ear, the nearest point to Miss Maggie's lips that was available, until, with tender determination, he turned her face to his. A moment later, blushing rosily, Miss Maggie drew herself away. "There, we've been quite silly enough, old folks like us." "We're not silly. Love is never silly, not real love like ours. Besides, we're only as old as we feel. Do you feel old? I don't. I've lost years since this morning, and you know I'm just beginning to live, really live, anyway. I feel 21. "I'm afraid you act it," said Miss Maggie with mock severity. "You would if you'd been through what I have," retorted Mr. Smith, drawing a long breath. "And when I think what a botch I made of it to begin with, you see, I didn't mean to start off with that first thing, and I was so afraid that even if you did care for John Smith, you wouldn't for me, just at first. But you do, dear." At arm's length he held her off, his hands on her shoulders. His happy eyes searching her face saw the dawn of the dazed question. "Wouldn't care for you if I did for John Smith? Why, you are John Smith. What do you mean?" she demanded, her eyes slowly sweeping him from head to foot and back again. "What do you mean?" "Miss Maggie!" Instinctively his tongue went back to the old manner of address, but his hands still held her shoulders. You can't mean that you didn't understand, that you don't understand that I am— Oh, good heavens! Well, I have made a mess of it this time," he groaned. Releasing his hold on her shoulders, he turned and began to tramp up and down the room. "Nice little John Alden Miles Standish affair this is now, upon my word. Miss Maggie, have I got to propose to you all over again for another man now?" "For another man? I don't think I understand you." Miss Maggie had grown a little white. "Then you don't know. You didn't understand a few minutes ago when I spoke first, when I asked you about those 20 millions. She lifted her hand quickly, pleadingly. "Mr. Smith, please don't let's bring money into it at all. I don't care. I don't care a bit if you haven't got any money." Mr. Smith's jaw dropped. "If I haven't got any money!" he ejaculated stupidly. "No. Oh, yes, I know. I said I loved money." The rich red came back to her face in a flood. "But I didn't mean, and it's just as much of a test as an opportunity when you don't have money, more so, if anything. I didn't mean it that way. I never thought of how you might take it, as if I wanted it. I don't. Indeed I don't. Oh, can't you understand?" "Understand? Good heavens!" Mr. Smith threw up both his hands. "And I thought I'd given myself away, Miss Maggie." He came to her and stood close, but he did not offer to touch her. "I thought after I'd said what I did about those 20 millions that you understood, that you knew I was Stanley Fulton himself." "That you were who?" Miss Maggie stood motionless, her eyes looking straight into his, amazed, incredulous. "Stanley Fulton. I am Stanley Fulton. My God, Maggie, don't look at me like that. I thought I had told you. Indeed I did." She was backing away now, slowly, step by step. Anger, almost loathing, had taken the place of the amazement and incredulity in her eyes. "And you are Mr. Fulton?" "Yes, yes, but—" "And you've been here all these months, yes, years, under a false name, pretending to be what you weren't, talking to us, eating at our tables, winning our confidence, letting us talk to you about yourself, even pretending that— Oh, how could you?" Her voice broke. "Maggie, dearest," he begged, springing toward her, "if you'll only let me—" But she stopped him peremptorily, drawing herself to her full height. "I am not your dearest," she flamed angrily. "I did not give my love to you." "Maggie," he implored. But she drew back still farther. "No, I gave it to John Smith, gentleman, I supposed. A man, poor, yes, I believed him poor, but a man who at least had a right to his name. I didn't give it to Mr. Stanley G. Fulton, spy, trickster, who makes life itself a masquerade for sport. I do not know Mr. Stanley G. Fulton, and I do not wish to." The words ended in a sound very like a sob, but Miss Maggie, with her head still high, turned her back and walked to the window. The man, apparently stunned for a moment, stood watching her, his eyes grieved, dismayed, hopeless. Then, white-faced, he turned and walked toward the door. With his hand almost on the knob, he slowly wheeled about and faced the woman again. He hesitated visibly, then in a dull, lifeless voice he began to speak. "Miss Maggie, before John Smith steps entirely out of your life, he would like to say just this, please, not in justification, but in explanation of Stanley G. Fulton. Fulton did not intend to be a spy or a trickster, or to make life a masquerade for sport. He was a lonely old man. He felt old. He had no wife or child. True, he had no one to care for, but he had no one to care for him either. Remember that, please. He did have a great deal of money, more than he knew what to do with. Oh, he tried various ways of spending it. Never mind what they were. They are not worth speaking of here. They resulted chiefly in showing him that he wasn't as wise as he might be in that line, perhaps." The man paused and wet his lips. At the window Miss Maggie still stood with her back turned as before. "The time came, finally," resumed the man, "when Fulton began to wonder what would become of his millions when he was done with them. He had a feeling that he would like to will a good share of them to some of his own kin, but he had no nearer relatives than some cousins back east in Hillerton." Miss Maggie at the window drew in her breath and held it suspended, letting it out slowly. "He didn't know anything about these cousins," went on the man dully, wearily, "and he got to wondering what they would do with the money. I think he felt, as you said to-day that you feel, that one must know how to spend $5 if one would get the best out of 5,000. So Fulton felt that before he gave a man 15 or 20 millions, he would like to know what he would probably do with them. He had seen so many cases where sudden great wealth had brought great sorrow. And so then he fixed up a little scheme. He would give each one of these 3 cousins of his $100,000 apiece, and then, unknown to them, he would get acquainted with them and see which of them would be likely to make the best use of those 20 millions. It was a silly scheme, of course, a silly, absurd foolishness from beginning to end. He did not finish his sentence. There was a rush of swift feet, a swish of skirts. Then full upon him there fell a whirlwind of sobs, clinging arms, and incoherent ejaculations. "It wasn't silly! It wasn't silly! It was perfectly splendid! I see it all now! I see it all! I understand! Oh, I think it was wonderful! And I'm so ashamed!" Later, very much later, when something like lucid coherence had become an attribute of their conversation, as they sat together upon the old sofa, the man drew a long breath and said, "Then I'm quite forgiven? There is nothing to forgive." And you consider yourself engaged to both John Smith and Stanley G. Fulton? It sounds pretty bad, but yes, blushed Miss Maggie. And you must love Stanley G. Fulton just exactly as well, no, a little better than you did John Smith. I'll try to, if he's as lovable. Miss Maggie's head was at a saucy tilt. He'll try to be, but it won't be all play, you know, for you. You've got to tell him what to do with those 20 millions. By the way, what will you do with them? He demanded interestedly. Miss Maggie looked up, plainly startled. Why, yes, that's so. If you're Mr. Fulton, you have got... And I forgot all about those 20 millions, and they're yours, Mr. Smith. No, they're not Mr. Smith's, objected the man. They belong to Fulton, if you please. Furthermore, can't you call me anything but that abominable Mr. Smith? My name is Stanley. You might, abbreviate it to, Stan, now? Perhaps so, but I shan't, laughed Miss Maggie. Not yet. You may be thankful I have wits enough left to call you anything, after becoming engaged to two men all at once, and with having the responsibility of spending 20 millions, too. Oh, yes, the money. Her eyes began to shine. She drew another long breath. Oh, we can do so much with that money. Why, only think what is needed right here. Better milk for the babies, and a community house, and the streets cleaner, and a new carpet for the church, and a new hospital with... But see here, aren't you going to spend some of that money on yourself? He demanded. Isn't there something you want? She gave him a merry glance. Myself? Dear me, I guess I am. I'm going to Egypt and China and Japan, with you, of course, and books. Oh, you never saw such a lot of books as I shall buy. And oh, I'll spend heaps on just my selfish self. You see if I don't. But first, oh, there are so many things that I've wanted to do, and it's just come over me this minute that now I can do them. And you know how Hillerton needs a new hospital. Her eyes grew luminous and earnest again. And I want to build a store and run it so the girls can live, and a factory, too, and decent homes for the workmen, and a big market where they can get their food at cost, and there's the playground for the children, and... But Mr. Smith was laughing and lifted both hands in mock despair. Look here, he challenged, I thought you were marrying me. But are you marrying me or that confounded money? Miss Maggie laughed merrily. Yes, I know, but you see... She stopped short. An odd expression came to her eyes. Suddenly she laughed again and threw into his eyes a look so merry, so whimsical, so altogether challenging that he demanded, Well, what is it now? Oh, it's so good. I have half a mind to tell you. Of course you'll tell me. Where are you going? He asked disconcertedly. Miss Maggie had left the sofa and was standing as if half poised for flight midway to the door. I think, yes, I will tell you, she nodded, her cheeks very pink. But I wanted to be over here to tell it. Way over there? Yes, way over here. Do you remember those letters I got a while ago, and the call from the Boston lawyer that I wouldn't tell you about? I should say I did. Well, you know, you thought they had something to do with my money, that I lost some. I did, dear. Well, they did have something to do with money. I knew they did, triumphed the man. Oh, why wouldn't you tell me then and let me help you some way? She shook her head nervously and backed nearer the door. He had half started from his seat. No, stay there. If you don't, I won't tell you. He fell back, but with obvious reluctance. Well, as I said, it did have something to do with my money, but just now, when you asked me if I was marrying you or your money... But I was in fun, you know I was in fun, demanded the man hotly. Oh, yes, I knew that, nodded Miss Maggie. But it made me laugh and remember the letters. You see, they weren't as you thought. They didn't tell me of money lost. They told me of money gained. Gained? Yes. that father's cousin George in Alaska had died and left me $50,000. But, my dear woman, why in heaven's name wouldn't you tell me that? Because Miss Maggie took a step nearer the door. You see, I thought you were poor, very poor, and I wouldn't even own up to it myself, but I knew in my heart that I was afraid if you heard I had this money, you wouldn't ask me to. She was blushing so adorably now that the man understood and leaped to his feet. Maggie, you darling! But the door had shut. Miss Maggie had fled. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Oh, Money, Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter. That miserable money. In the evening, after the Morton girls had gone to their rooms, Miss Maggie and Mr. Smith faced the thing squarely. "Of course," he began with a sigh, "I'm really not out of the woods at all. Blissfully happy as I am, I'm really deeper in the woods than ever, for now I've got you there with me to look out for. However successfully John Smith might dematerialize into nothingness, Maggie Duff can't. No, I know she can't," admitted Miss Maggie soberly. "Yet if she marries John Smith, she'll have to, and if she doesn't marry him, how's Stanley G. Fulton going to do his courting? He can't come here." "But he must!" Miss Maggie looked up with startled eyes. "Why, Mr. Smith, you'll have to tell them who you are. You'll have to tell them right away." The man made a playfully wry face. "I shall be glad," he observed, "when I shan't have to be held off at the end of a Mr. However, we'll let that pass until we settle the other matter. Have you given any thought as to how I'm going to tell Cousin Frank and Cousin James and Cousin Flora that I am Stanley G. Fulton?" "No, except that you must do it," she answered decidedly. "I don't think you ought to deceive them another minute. Not another minute." Mr. Smith's eyes grew reflective. "And had you thought as to what would happen when I did tell them?" "Why, no, not particularly, except that they naturally wouldn't like it at first, and that you'd have to explain, just as you did to me, why you did it. And do you think they'll like it any better when I do explain? Think." Miss Maggie meditated. Then, a little tremulously, she drew in her breath. She lifted startled eyes to his face. "Why, you'd have to tell them that you did it for a test, wouldn't you?" "If I told the truth, yes." "And they'd know, they couldn't help knowing, that they had failed to meet it adequately." "Yes." "And would that help matters any? Make things any happier all around?" "No, oh, no." She frowned despairingly. "Would it do anybody any real good now? Think of that." "No, no," she admitted reluctantly, "except that you'd be doing right." "But would I be doing right? And another thing. Aside from the mortification, dismay, and anger of my good cousins, have you thought what I'd be bringing on you?" "Me?" "Yes. In less than half a dozen hours after the Blaisdells know that Mr. John Smith was Stanley G. Fulton, Hillerton would know it. And in less than half a dozen more hours, Boston, New York, Chicago, to say nothing of a dozen lesser cities, would know it if there didn't happen to be anything bigger on foot. Headlines an inch high would proclaim the discovery of the missing Stanley G. Fulton, and the fine print below would tell everything that happened, and a great deal that didn't happen, in the carrying out of the eccentric multi-millionaire's extraordinary scheme of testing his relatives with $100,000 apiece to find a suitable heir. Your picture would adorn the front page of the yellowest of yellow journals, and—" "My picture? Oh, no, no!" gasped Miss Maggie. "Oh, yes, yes," smiled the man imperturbably. "You'll be in it, too. Aren't you the affianced bride of Mr. Stanley G. Fulton?" I can see them now. In search of an heir and finds a wife. Charming Miss Maggie Duff falls in love with plain John Smith. And, oh, no, no, moaned Miss Maggie, shrinking back as if already the lurid headlines were staring her in the face. Mr. Smith laughed. Oh, well, it might not be so bad as that, of course, but you never can tell. Undoubtedly, there are elements for a pretty good story in the case, and some man with nothing more important to write up is bound to make the most of it somewhere. Then other papers will copy. There's sure to be unpleasant publicity, my dear, if the truth once leaks out. But what had you planned to do? She faltered, shuddering again. Well, I had planned something like this. Pretty quick now, Mr. Smith was to announce the completion of his Blaisdell data, and with properly grateful farewells, take his departure from Hillerton. He would go to South America. There he would go inland on some sort of a simple expedition with a few native guides and carriers, but no other companion. Somewhere in the wilderness he would shed his beard and his name, and would emerge in his proper person of Stanley G. Fulton, and promptly take passage for the States. Of course, upon the arrival in Chicago of Mr. Stanley G. Fulton, there would be a slight flurry at his appearance, and a few references to the $100,000 gifts to the Eastern relatives, and sundry speculations as to the why and how of the exploring trip. There would be various rumors and alleged interviews, but Mr. Stanley G. Fulton never was noted for his communicativeness, and after a very short time the whole thing would be dismissed as probably another of the gentleman's well-known eccentricities, and there it would end. "Oh, I see," murmured Miss Maggie, in very evident relief. "That would be better in some ways. Only it does seem terrible not to tell them who you are. But we have just proved that to do that wouldn't bring happiness anywhere, and would bring misery everywhere, haven't we?" Yes." "Then why do it? Particularly as by not doing it I am not defrauding anybody in the least. No, that part isn't worrying me a bit now, but there is one point that does worry me very much." "What do you mean? What is it?" "Yourself. My scheme gets Stanley G. Fulton back to life and Chicago very nicely, but it doesn't get Maggie Duff there worth a cent. Maggie Duff can't marry Mr. John Smith in Hillerton and arrive in Chicago as the wife of Stanley G. Fulton, can she?" No, but he can come back and get her if he wants her." Miss Maggie blushed. "If he wants her, indeed!" Miss Maggie blushed all the more at the method and the fervor of Mr. Smith's answer to this. "Come back as Mr. Stanley G. Fulton, you mean?" went on Mr. Smith, smiling at Miss Maggie's hurried efforts to smooth her ruffled hair. "Too risky, my dear. He'd look altogether too much like Mr. John Smith." "But your beard would be gone. I wonder how I shall like you without a beard." She eyed him critically. Mr. Smith laughed and threw up his hands with a doleful shrug. "That's what comes of courting as one man and marrying as another," he groaned. Then, sternly, "I'll warn you right now, Maggie Duff, that Stanley G. Fulton is going to be awful jealous of John Smith if you don't look out." "He should have thought of that before," retorted Miss Maggie, her eyes mischievous. "But tell me, wouldn't you ever dare to come in your proper person?" "Never, or at least not for some time. The beard would be gone, to be sure, but there'd be the rest to tattle: eyes, voice, size, manner, walk, everything. And smoked glasses couldn't cover all that, you know. Besides, glasses would be taboo anyway. They'd only result in making me look more like John Smith than ever. John Smith, you remember, wore smoked glasses for some time to hide Mr. Stanley G. Fulton from the ubiquitous reporter. No, Mr. Stanley G. Fulton can't come to Hillerton. So, as Mahomet can't go to the mountain must come to Mahomet." "Meaning," Miss Maggie's eyes were growing dangerously mutinous, "that you will have to come to Chicago, yes, and court you? No, sir, thank you." Mr. Smith chuckled softly. "I love you with your head tilted that way." Miss Maggie promptly tilted it the other. or that either, for that matter," continued Mr. Smith genially. "However, speaking of courting, Mr. Fulton will do that all right, and endeavor to leave nothing lacking, either as to quantity or quality. Think now, don't you know anyone in Chicago? Haven't you got some friend that you can visit?" "No." Miss Maggie's answer was prompt and emphatic, too prompt and too emphatic for unquestioning acceptance. "Oh, yes, you have," asserted the man cheerfully. "I don't know her name, but she's there. She's waving a red flag from your face this minute. Now listen. Well, turn your head away if you like, if you can listen better that way," he went on tranquilly, paying no attention to her little gasp. "Well, all you have to do is to write the lady you're coming, and go. Never mind who she is. Mr. Stanley G. Fulton will find a way to meet her. Trust him for that. Then he'll call you and meet you, and be so pleased to see you. The rest will be easy. There'll be a regular whirlwind courtship then. Calls, dinners, theaters, candy, books, flowers. Then Mr. Stanley G. Fulton will propose marriage. You'll be immensely surprised, of course, but you'll accept. Then we'll get married," he finished with a deep sigh of satisfaction. "Mr. Smith!" ejaculated Miss Maggie faintly. "Say, can't you call me anything?" he began wrathfully, but interrupted himself. "However, it's better that you don't, after all, because I've got to be Mr. Smith as long as I stay here. But you wait till you meet Mr. Stanley G. Fulton in Chicago. Now, what's her name, and where does she live?" Miss Maggie laughed in spite of herself, as she said severely, "Her name, indeed! I'm afraid Mr. Stanley G. Fulton is so in the habit of having his own way that he forgets he is still Mr. John Smith. However, there is an old schoolmate," she acknowledged demurely. "Of course there is. Now write her at once and tell her you're coming." "But she may not be there." "Then get her there. She's got to be there. And listen, I think you'd better plan to go pretty soon after I go to South America. Then you can be there when Mr. Stanley G. Fulton arrives in Chicago, and can write the news back here to Hillerton. Oh, they'll get it in the papers in time, of course, but I think it had better come from you first. You see, the reappearance on this earth of Mr. Stanley G. Fulton is going to be of some moment to them, you know. There is Mrs. Hattie, for instance, who is counting on the rest of the money next November. Yes, I know it. It will mean a good deal to them, of course. Still, I don't believe Hattie is really expecting the money. At any rate, she hasn't said anything about it very lately, perhaps because she's been too busy bemoaning the pass the present money has brought them to." "Yes, I know," frowned Mr. Smith, with a gloomy sigh. "That miserable money." No, I didn't mean to bring that up," apologized Miss Maggie quickly, with an apprehensive glance into his face. "And it wasn't miserable money a bit. Besides, Hattie has learned her lesson, I'm sure, and she'll do altogether differently in the new home. But, Mr. Smith, am I never to come back here? Can't we come back ever?" "Indeed we can. Sometime by and by, when all this is blown over, and they've forgotten how Mr. Smith looks, we can come back then. Meanwhile, you can come alone, a very little. I shan't let you leave me very much, but I understand you'll have to come to see your friends. Besides, there are all those playgrounds for the babies, and cleaner milk for the streets, and—" "Cleaner milk for the streets, indeed! What? Oh, yes, it was milk for the babies, wasn't it?" he teased. "Well, however that may be, you'll have to come back to superintend all those things you've been wanting to do so long. But—" his face grew a little wistful. "You don't want to spend too much time here. You know, Chicago has a few babies that need cleaner milk." "Yes, I know." Her face grew softly luminous, as it had grown earlier in the afternoon. "So you can bestow some of your charity there. And—" "It isn't charity," she interrupted with suddenly flashing eyes. "Oh, how I hate that word! The way it's used, I mean. Of course, the real charity means love indeed. I suppose it was love that made John Daly give $100 to the Pension Fund Fair, after he jewed it out of those poor girls behind his counters." and Mrs. Morse went around everywhere telling how kind dear Mr. Daly was to give so much to charity. Charity! Nobody wants charity, except a few lazy rascals like those beggars of Flora's. But we all want our rights. And if half the world gave the other half its rights, there wouldn't be any charity, I believe. Dear, dear, what have we here? A rabid little socialist? Mr. Smith held up both hands in mock terror. I shall be petitioning her for my bread and butter yet. Nonsense. But honestly, Mr. Smith, when I think of all that money, her eyes began to shine again, and of what we can do with it, I just can't believe it's so. But you aren't expecting that 20 millions are going to right all the wrongs in the world, are you? Mr. Smith's eyes were quizzical. Oh, no, but we can help some that we know about. But it isn't that I just want to give, you know. We must get behind things, to the causes. We must make the Mr. Dalys pay more to their girls before they pay anything to pension funds, eh? Laughed Mr. Smith, as Miss Maggie came to a breathless pause. Exactly, nodded Miss Maggie earnestly. Oh, can't you see what we can do with that $20 million? Mr. Smith, his gaze on Miss Maggie's flushed cheeks and shining eyes, smiled tenderly. Then with mock severity he frowned. I see that I'm being married for my money after all, he scolded. Pooh! Sniffed Miss Maggie so altogether bewitchingly that Mr. Smith gave her a rapturous kiss. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Oh, Money, Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter. Early in July, Mr. Smith took his departure from Hillerton. He made a farewell call upon each of the Blaisdell families, and thanked them heartily for all their kindness in assisting him with his Blaisdell book. The Blaisdells, one and all, said they were very sorry to have him go. Miss Flora frankly wiped her eyes, and told Mr. Smith she could never thank him enough for what he had done for her. Millicent, too, with shy eyes averted, told him she could never forget what he had done for her and for Donald. James and Flora and Frank and even Jane said that they would like to have one of the Blaisdell books when they were published to hand down in the family. Flora took out her purse and said that she would pay for hers now, but Mr. Smith hastily and with some evident embarrassment refused the money, saying that he could not tell yet what the price of the book would be. All the Blaisdells except Frank, Fred, and Bessie went to the station to see Mr. Smith off. They said they wanted to. They told him he was just like one of the family anyway, and they declared they hoped he would come back soon. Frank telephoned him that he would have gone too if he had not had so much to do at the store. Mr. Smith seemed pleased at all this attention. He seemed, indeed, quite touched. But he seemed also embarrassed. In fact, he seemed often embarrassed during those last few days at Hillerton. Miss Maggie Duff did not go to the station to see Mr. Smith off. Miss Flora, on her way home, stopped at the Duff cottage, and reproached Miss Maggie for the delinquency. "Nonsense! Why should I go?" laughed Miss Maggie. "Why shouldn't you?" retorted Miss Flora. "All the rest of us did, most." "Well, that's all right. You're Blaisdells, but I'm not, you know." "You're just as good as one, Maggie Duff. Besides, hasn't that man boarded here for over a year, and paid you good money, too?" "Why, yes, of course." "Well, then, I don't think it would have hurt you any to show him this last little attention. He'll think you don't like him, or are you mad about something when all the rest of us went?" "Nonsense, Flora." "Well, then, if—" "Why, Maggie Duff, you're blushing." She broke off, peering into Miss Maggie's face in a way that did not tend to lessen the unmistakable color that was creeping to her forehead. "You are blushing. I declare, if you were 20 years younger, and I didn't know better, I should say that—" She stopped abruptly, then plunged on, her countenance suddenly alight with a new idea.
Now I know why you didn't go to the station, Maggie Duff. That man proposed to you, and you refused him," she triumphed. "Flora!" gasped Miss Maggie, her face scarlet. "He did. I know he did. Hattie always said it would be a match from the very first when he came here to your house." "Flora!" gasped Miss Maggie again, looking about her very much as if she were meditating flight. "Well, she did, but I didn't believe it. Now I know. You refused him, now didn't you?" "Certainly not." Miss Maggie caught her breath a little convulsively. "Honest?" "Flora, stop this silly talk right now. I have answered you once. I shan't again." Miss Flora fell back in her chair. "Well, I suppose you didn't, then, if you say so. And I don't need to ask if you accepted him. You didn't, of course, or you'd have been there to see him off. And he wouldn't have gone then anyway, probably. So he didn't ask you, I suppose. Well, I never did believe, like Hattie did, that—" "Flora," interrupted Miss Maggie desperately, "will you stop talking in that absurd way? Listen, I did not care to go to the station today. I am very busy. I'm going away next week. I'm going to Chicago." "To Chicago? You?" Miss Flora came erect in her chair. "Yes, for a visit. I'm going to see my old classmate, Nellie Maynard, Mrs. Tyndall." "Maggie!" "What's the matter?" "Why, nothing. It's lovely, of course, only I'm so surprised. You never go anywhere." "Oh, the more reason why I should, then. It's time I did," smiled Miss Maggie. Miss Maggie was looking more at ease now. "When are you going?" "Next Wednesday. I heard from Nellie last night. She is expecting me then." "How perfectly splendid! I'm so glad. And I do hope you can do it, and that it won't peter out at the last minute, same as most of your good times do. Poor Maggie! And you've had such a hard life, and your boarder leaving, too. That'll make a lot of difference in your pocketbook, won't it? But, Maggie, you'll have to have some new clothes." "Of course. I've been shopping this afternoon. I've got to have, lots of things." "Of course you have. And, Maggie—" Miss Flora's face grew eager. "Please, please, won't you let me help you a little about those clothes? And get some nice ones, some real nice ones for once. You know how I'd love to. Please, Maggie, there's a good girl." "Thank you, no, dear," refused Miss Maggie, shaking her head with a smile. "But I appreciate your kindness just the same. Indeed I do." "If you wouldn't be so horrid proud," pouted Miss Flora. But Miss Maggie stopped her with a gesture. "No, listen. I have something to tell you. I was going to tell you soon, anyway, and I'll tell you now. I have money, dear. Lots of it now." "You have money?" "Yes. Father's cousin George died 2 months ago." "The rich one in Alaska?" "Yes. And to Father's daughter he left $50,000. "Maggie!" "And I never even saw him. But he loved Father, you know, years ago, and Father loved him." "But had you ever heard from him late years?" "Not much. Father was very angry because he went to Alaska in the first place, you know, and they haven't ever written very often." $50,000! And you've got it now?" "Not yet, all of it. They sent me $1,000 just for pin money, they said. The lawyer's written several times, and he's been here once. I believe it's all to come next month." "Oh, I'm so glad, Maggie," breathed Flora. "I'm so glad. I don't know of anybody I'd rather see take a little comfort in life than you." At the door, 15 minutes later, Miss Flora said again how glad she was, but she added wistfully, "I'm sure I don't know, though, what I'm going to do all summer without you. Just think how lonesome we'll be, you gone to Chicago, Hattie and Jim and all their family moved to Plainville, and even Mr. Smith gone, too. And I think we're going to miss Mr. Smith a whole lot, too. He was a real nice man. Don't you think so, Maggie?" "Indeed I do think he was a very nice man," declared Miss Maggie. "Now, Flora, I shall want you to go shopping with me lots. Can you?" And Miss Flora, eagerly entering into Miss Maggie's discussions of frills and flounces, failed to notice that Miss Maggie had dropped the subject of Mr. Smith somewhat hastily. Hillerton had much to talk about during those summer days. Mr. Smith's going had created a mild discussion, the ancestor fellow was well known and well liked in the town, but even his departure did not arouse the interest that was bestowed upon the removal of the James Blaisdells to Plainville. And this in turn did not cause so great an excitement as did the news that Miss Maggie Duff had inherited $50,000 and had gone to Chicago to spend it, and the fact that nearly all who heard this promptly declared that they hoped she would spend a good share of it in Chicago or elsewhere on herself showed pretty well just where Miss Maggie Duff stood in the hearts of Hillerton. It was early in September that Miss Flora had the letter from Miss Maggie. Not but that she had received letters from Miss Maggie before, but that the contents of this one made it at once to all the Blaisdells the letter. Miss Flora began to read it, gave a little cry, and sprang to her feet. Standing, her breath suspended, she finished it. 5 minutes later, gloves half on and hat askew, she was hurrying across the common to her brother Frank's home. "Jane, Jane," she panted as soon as she found her sister-in-law, "I've had a letter from Maggie. Mr. Stanley G. Fulton has come back. He's come back." "Come back? Alive, you mean? Oh, my goodness gracious! What'll Hattie do? She's just been living on having that money, and us with all we've lost, too. But then maybe we shouldn't have got it anyway. My stars! And Maggie wrote you? Where's the letter?" "There, I never thought to bring it," ejaculated Miss Flora vexedly. "But never mind, I can tell you all she said. She didn't write much. She said it would be in all the Eastern papers right away, of course, but she wanted to tell us first, so we wouldn't be so surprised. He's just come, walked into his lawyer's office without a telegram or anything. Said he didn't want any fuss made. Mr. Tyndall brought home the news that night in an extra, but that's all it told. Just that Mr. Stanley G. Fulton, the multi-millionaire who disappeared nearly 2 years ago on an exploring trip to South America, had come back alive and well. Then it told all about the 2 letters he left and the money he left to us and all that, Maggie said, and it talked a lot about how lucky it was that he got back just in time before the other letter had to be opened next November. But it didn't say any more about his trip or anything. The morning papers will have more, Maggie said, probably. "Yes, of course," nodded Jane, rolling the corner of her upper apron nervously. Since the $40,000 loss, Jane had gone back to her old habit of wearing 2 aprons. "Where do you suppose he's been all this time? Was he lost or just exploring?" Maggie said it wasn't known, that the paper didn't say. It was an extra anyway, and it just got in the bare news of his return. But we'll know, of course. The papers here will tell us. Besides, Maggie'll write again about it, I'm sure. Poor Maggie! I'm so glad she's having such a good time." "Yes, of course," nodded Jane again nervously. "Say, Flora, I wonder, do you suppose we'll ever hear from him? He left us all that money. He knows that, of course. He can't ask for it back. The lawyer said he couldn't do that. Don't you remember? But I wonder, do you suppose we ought to write him and thank him?" "Oh, mercy!" exclaimed Miss Flora, aghast. "Mercy me, Jane! I'd be scared to death to do such a thing as that. Oh, you don't think we've got to do that?" Miss Flora had grown actually pale. Jane frowned. "I don't know. We'd want to do what was right and proper, of course, but I don't see—" She paused helplessly. Miss Flora gave a sudden hysterical little laugh. "Well, I don't see how we're going to find out what's proper in this case," she giggled. "We can't write to a magazine, same as I did when I wanted to know how to answer invitations and fix my knives and forks on the table. We can't write to them, 'cause nothing like this ever happened before, and they wouldn't know what to say. How'd we look writing, 'Please, dear editor, when a man wills you $100,000 and he comes to life again, is it proper or not proper to write and thank him?' They'd think we was crazy, and they have reason to. For my part, The telephone bell rang sharply, and Jane rose to answer it. She was gone some time. When she came back, she was even more excited. It was Frank. He's heard it. It was in the papers tonight. Did it tell anything more? Not much, I guess. Still, there was some. He's going to bring it home. It's almost supper time. Why don't you wait? She questioned, as Miss Flora got hastily to her feet. Miss Flora shook her head. "I can't. I left everything just as it was and ran when I got the letter. I'll get a paper myself on the way home. I'm going to call up Hattie, too, on the long distance. My, it's most as exciting as it was when it first came. The money, I mean. Isn't it?" panted Miss Flora as she hurried away. The Blaisdells bought many papers during the next few days, but even by the time that the Stanley G. Fulton sensation had dwindled to a short paragraph in an obscure corner of a middle page, they, and the public in general, were really little the wiser except for these bare facts. Stanley G. Fulton had arrived at a South American hotel from the interior, had registered as S. Fulton, frankly to avoid publicity, and had taken immediate passage to New York. Arriving at New York, still to avoid publicity, he had not telegraphed his attorneys, but had taken the sleeper for Chicago, and had fortunately not met anyone who recognized him until his arrival in that city. He had brought home several fine specimens of Incan textiles and potteries, and he declared that he had had a very enjoyable and profitable trip. Beyond that he would say nothing. He did not care to talk of his experiences, he said. For a time, of course, his return was made much of. Fake interviews and rumors of threatened death and disaster in impenetrable jungles made frequent appearance, but in an incredibly short time the flame of interest died from want of fuel to feed upon, and, as Mr. Stanley G. Fulton himself had once predicted, the matter was soon dismissed as merely another of the multi-millionaire's well-known eccentricities. All of this the Blaisdells heard from Miss Maggie in addition to seeing it in the newspapers. But very soon from Miss Maggie they began to learn more. Before a fortnight had passed, Miss Flora received another letter from Chicago that sent her flying as before to her sister-in-law. "Jane, Jane, Maggie's met him!" she cried, breathlessly bursting into the kitchen, where Jane was paring the apples that she would not trust to the maid's more wasteful knife. "Met him? Met who?" "Mr. Fulton. She's talked with him. She wrote me all about it." "Our Mr. Fulton?" "Yes." Flora! With a hasty twirl of a now reckless knife, Jane finished the last apple, set the pan on before the maid, and hurried her visitor into the living-room. "Now tell me quick, what did she say? Is he nice? Did she like him? Did he know she belonged to us?" Yes, everything," nodded Miss Flora, sinking into a chair. "She liked him real well, she said, and he knows all about that she belongs to us. She said he was real interested in us. Oh, I hope she didn't tell him about Fred." "And that awful gold mine stock," moaned Jane. "But she wouldn't. I know she wouldn't." "Of course she wouldn't," cried Miss Flora. "'Tisn't like Maggie one bit. She'd only tell the nice things, I'm sure. And of course she'd tell him how pleased we were with the money." "Yes, of course, of course. And to think she's met him, really met him," breathed Jane. "Millicent!" She turned an excited face to her daughter, who had just entered the room. "What do you think? Aunt Flora's just had a letter from Aunt Maggie, and she's met Mr. Fulton, actually talked with him." "Really? Oh, how perfectly splendid! Is he nice? Did she like him?" Miss Flora laughed. "That's just what your mother asked. Yes, he's real nice, your Aunt Maggie says, and she likes him very much." "But how'd she do it? How'd she happen to meet him?" demanded Jane. "Well, it seems he knew Mr. Tyndall, and Mr. Tyndall brought him home one night and introduced him to his wife and Maggie. And since then he's been very nice to them. He's taken them out in his automobile and taken them to the theater twice." "That's because she belongs to us, of course," nodded Jane wisely. "Yes, I suppose so," agreed Flora. "And I think it's very kind of him." "Pooh!" sniffed Millicent airily. "I think he does it because he wants to. You never did appreciate Aunt Maggie. I'll warrant she's nicer and sweeter, and yes, prettier, than lots of those old Chicago women. Aunt Maggie looked positively handsome that day she left here last July. She looked so absolutely happy. Probably he likes to take her places. Anyhow, I'm glad she's having one good time before she dies." "Yes, so am I, my dear. We all are," sighed Miss Flora. "Poor Maggie. I only wish he'd marry her and give her a good time all her life," avowed Millicent, lifting her chin. "Marry her!" exclaimed two scornful voices. "Well, why not? She's good enough for him," bridled Millicent. "Aunt Maggie's good enough for anybody." "Of course she is, child," laughed Miss Flora. "Maggie's a saint, if ever there was one." "Yes, but I wouldn't call her a marrying saint," smiled Jane. "Well, I don't know about that," frowned Miss Flora thoughtfully. "Hattie always declared there'd be a match between her and Mr. Smith, you know." "Yes, but there wasn't one, was there?" twitted Jane. "Well, then, I shall stick to my original statement that Maggie Duff is a saint, all right, but not a marrying one. Unless someone marries her now for her money, of course." "As if Aunt Maggie'd stand for that," scoffed Millicent. "Besides, she wouldn't have to. Aunt Maggie's good enough to be married for herself." "There, there, child. Just because you are a love-sick little piece of romance just now, you needn't think everybody else is," her mother reproved her a little sharply. But Millicent only laughed merrily as she disappeared into her own room. "Speaking of Mr. Smith, I wonder where he is, and if he'll ever come back here," mused Miss Flora aloud. "I wish he would. He was a very nice man, and I liked him." "Goodness, Flora, you aren't getting romantic, too, are you?" teased her sister-in-law. "Nonsense, Jane!" ejaculated Miss Flora sharply, buttoning up her coat. "I'm no more romantic than poor Maggie herself is." 2 weeks later, to a day, came Miss Maggie's letter announcing her engagement to Mr. Stanley G. Fulton, and saying that she was to be married in Chicago before Christmas. End of chapter 25.
Recording by Phil Chenevert, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chapter 26 of Oh, Money, Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter. Re-enter Mr. Stanley G. Fulton. In the library of Mrs. Thomas Tyndall's Chicago home, Mr. Stanley G. Fulton was impatiently awaiting the appearance of Miss Maggie Duff. In a minute she came in, looking charmingly youthful in her new, well-fitting frock. The man, quickly on his feet at her entrance, gave her a lover's ardent kiss, but almost instantly he held her off at arm's length. "Why, dearest, what's the matter?" he demanded. "What do you mean? You look as if something had happened. Not exactly a bad something, but what is it?" Miss Maggie laughed softly. "That's one of the very nicest things about you, Mr. Stanley G. Fulton John Smith," she sighed, nestling comfortably into the curve of his arm as they sat down on the divan, "that you notice things so, and it seems so good to me to have somebody notice. Poor lonely little woman, and to think of all those years I've wasted. Oh, but I shan't be lonely any more now. And listen, I'll tell you what made me look so funny. I've had a letter from Flora. You know I wrote them about my coming marriage." Yes, eagerly. "Well, what did they say?" Miss Maggie laughed again. "I believe I'll let you read the letter for yourself, Stanley. It tells some things toward the end that I think you'll like to know," she said, a little hesitatingly, as she held out the letter she had brought into the room with her. "Good, I'd like to read it," cried Fulton, whisking the closely written sheets from the envelope. "My dear Maggie," Flora had written. "Well, mercy me, you have given us a surprise this time, and no mistake. Yet we're all real glad, Maggie, and we hope you'll be awfully happy. You deserve it all right. Poor Maggie, you've had such an awfully hard time all your life. Well, when your letter came, we were just going out to Jim's for an old-fashioned Thanksgiving dinner, so I took it along with me and read it to them all. I kept it till we were all together, too, though I most bursted with the news all the way out. Well, you ought to have heard their tongues wag. They were all struck dumb first, for a minute, all except Millicent. She spoke up the very first thing and clapped her hands. "There," she cried, "what did I tell you? I knew Aunt Maggie was good enough for anybody." To explain that, I'll have to go back a little. We were talking one day about you, Jane and Millicent and me, and we said you were a saint, only not a marrying saint. But Millicent thought you were, and it seems she was right. Oh, of course, we'd all thought once Mr. Smith might take a fancy to you, but we never dreamed of such a thing as this.
Mr. Stanley G. Fulton. Sakes alive, I can hardly sense it yet. Jane, for a minute, forgot how rich he was and spoke up real quick. It's for her money, of course. I knew someone would marry her for that $50,000. But she laughed then right off with the rest of us at the idea of a man worth 20 millions marrying anybody for $50,000. Benny says there ain't any man alive good enough for his Aunt Maggie. So if Mr. Fulton gets to being too high-headed sometimes, you can tell him what Benny says. But we're all real pleased, honestly, Maggie, and of course we're terribly excited. We're so sorry you're going to be married out there in Chicago. Why can't you make him come to Hillerton? Jane says she'd be glad to make a real nice wedding for you, and when Jane says a thing like that, you can know how much she's really saying, for Jane's feeling awfully poor these days since they lost all that money, you know. And we'd all like to see Mr. Fulton, too, Cousin Stanley, as Hattie always calls him. Please give him our congratulations. But there, that sounds funny, doesn't it? But the etiquette editors in the magazines say we must always give best wishes to the bride and congratulations to the groom. Only it seems funny here to congratulate that rich Mr. Fulton on marrying you. Oh, dear, I didn't mean it that way, Maggie. I declare, if that sentence wasn't way in the middle of this third page, that's so awfully hard for me to write anyway, I'd tear up this sheet and begin another. But after all, you'll understand, I'm sure. You know we all think the world of you, Maggie, and that I didn't mean anything against you. It's just that Mr. Fulton is such a big man and all, but you know what I mean. Well, anyway, if you can't come home here to be married, we hope you'll bring him here soon so we can see him and see you too. We miss you awfully, Maggie, truly we do, especially since Jim's folks went, and with Mr. Smith gone too, Jane and I are real lonesome. Jim and Hattie like real well where they are. They've got a real pretty home, and they're the biggest folks in town, so Hattie doesn't have to worry for fear she won't live quite so fine as her neighbors. Though, really, I think Hattie's got over that now a good deal. That awful thing of Fred's sobered her a lot, and taught her who her real friends were, and that money ain't everything. Fred is doing splendidly now, just as steady as a clock. It does my soul good to see him and his father together. They are just like chums. And Bessie, she isn't near so disagreeable and airy as she was. Hattie took her out of that school and put her into another one where she's getting some real learning and less society and frills and dancing. Jim is doing well, and I think Hattie's real happy. Oh, of course, when we first heard that Mr. Fulton had got back, I think she was kind of disappointed. You know, she always did insist we were going to have the rest of that money if she didn't show up. But she told me just Thanksgiving Day that she didn't know but 'twas just as well after all that she didn't have that money, for maybe Fred'd go wrong again, or it would strike Benny this time. Anyhow, however much money she had, she said, she'd never let her children spend so much again, and she found out money didn't bring happiness always anyway. Millicent and Donald are going to be married next summer. Donald don't get a very big salary yet, but Millicent says she won't mind a bit going back to economizing again, now that for once she's had all the chocolates and pink dresses she wanted. What a funny girl she is, but she's a dear girl just the same, and she's settled down real sensible now. She and Donald are as happy as can be, and even Jane likes Donald real well now. Jane's gone back to her tidies and aprons and skimping on everything, and she says she's got to make up that $40,000, but she enjoys it, I believe. Honestly, she acts most as happy trying to save 5 cents as Frank does earning it in his old place behind the counter. And that's saying a whole lot, as you know. Jane knows very well she doesn't have to pinch that way. They've got lots of the money left, and Frank's business is better than ever, but she just likes to. You complain because I don't tell you everything about myself in my letters, but there isn't anything to tell. I am well and happy, and I've just thought up the nicest thing to do. Mary Hicks came home from Boston sick last September, and she's been here at my house ever since. Her own home ain't no place for a sick person, you know, with all those children, and they're awfully poor, too. So I took her here with me. She's a real nice girl. She works in a department store and was all played out, but she's picked up wonderfully here and is going back next week. Well, she was telling me about a girl that works with her at the same counter, and saying how she wished she had a place like this to go to for a rest and change, so I'm going to do it. Give them one, I mean, she and the other girls. Mary says there are a dozen girls that she knows right there that are half sick, but would get well in a minute if they only had a few weeks of rest and quiet and good food. So I'm going to take them 2 at a time, so they'll be company for each other. Mary is going to fix it up for me down there and pick out the girls, and she says she knows the man who owns the store will be glad to let them off, for they are all good help, and he's been afraid he'd lose them. He'd offered them a month off besides their vacation, but they couldn't take it because they didn't have any place to go or money to pay. Of course, that part will be all right now, and I'm so glad and excited I don't know what to do. Oh, I do hope you tell Mr. Fulton sometime how happy he's made me and how perfectly splendid that money's been for me. Well, Maggie, this is a long letter, and I must close. Tell me all about the new clothes you're getting, and I hope you will get a lot. Lovingly yours, Flora. P.S. Does Mr. Fulton look like his pictures? You know, the one I've got. F. P.S. again, Maggie Duff, for pity's sake, never, never tell that man that I ever went into mourning for him and put flowers before his picture. I'd be mortified to death. Bless her heart. With a smile, Mr. Fulton folded the letter and handed it back to Miss Maggie. I didn't feel that I was betraying confidences under the circumstances, murmured Miss Maggie. Hardly. And there was a good deal in that letter that I did want you to see, added Miss Maggie. The congratulations, for one thing, of course, twinkled the man. Poor Maggie. I wanted you to see how really in the end that money was not doing so much harm after all, asserted Miss Maggie with some dignity, shaking her head at him reprovingly. I thought you'd be glad, sir. I am glad. I'm so glad that when I come to make my will now, I shouldn't wonder if I remember them all again. A little, that is, if I have anything left to will, he teased shamelessly. Oh, by the way, that makes me think. I've just been putting up a monument to John Smith. Stanley! Miss Maggie's voice carried genuine shocked distress. But, my dear Maggie, something was due the man, maintained Fulton, reaching for a small, flat parcel near him and placing it in Miss Maggie's hands. But, oh, Stanley, how could you? She shivered, her eyes on the words the millionaire had penciled on the brown paper covering of the parcel. Sacred to the memory of John Smith. Open it, directed the man. With obvious reluctance, Miss Maggie loosened the paper covers and peered within. The next moment she gave a glad cry. In her hands lay a handsome brown leather volume with gold letters reading, The Blaisdell Family by John Smith. And you did that? She asked, her eyes luminous. Yes, I shall send a copy each to Frank and Jim and Miss Flora, of course. That's the monument. I thought it due Mr. John Smith. Poor man, it's the least I can do for him, and the most, unless— He hesitated with an unmistakable look of embarrassment. Yes, prompted Miss Maggie eagerly. Yes? Well, unless I let you take me to Hillerton one of these days and see if Stanley G. Fulton, with your gracious help, can make peace for John Smith with those, cousins of mine. You see, I still feel confoundedly like that small boy at the keyhole, and I'd like to open that door. Could we do it, do you think? Do it? Of course we could. And, oh, Stanley, it's the one thing needed to make me perfectly happy. She sighed blissfully. End of chapter 26, recorded by Phil Chenevert. The end of Oh, Money, Money by Eleanor H. Porter.